If you ever time-travelled back to Edwardian Britain 1901 to 1910, give or take a few years, the first thing you'd notice after the hats big enough to shade an entire garden was the obsession with food, and not just eating it, but performing it. Dinner wasn't simply about filling your stomach, it was about filling an entire evening with a carefully choreographed ritual that combined fashion, power and bragging rights. To dine in Edwardian Britain was to step onto a stage where everyone knew their lines, except for you, the time traveller, fumbling with 12 forks and wondering why soup has its own spoon. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardians were heirs to the Victorian strict social codes, but they took those codes and cranked the glamour up to maximum voltage. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain rich, and the Empire had made it global. Nowhere was this more evident than at the dinner table. You didn't just eat a roast chicken, you ate chicken imported from France, stuffed with truffles from Italy, served on porcelain that cost more than your house, and all of it happened under chandeliers so bright you could probably see your own shame reflected in the silverware. Why dinner? Because Edwardians had discovered that food was the perfect excuse for flexing. Anyone could host a casual tea or luncheon, but a dinner party was a statement. It told the world, I have money, I have connections, and I have enough servants to make this ridiculous spectacle happen without burning the soup. A dinner party was social theatre, and the menu was just the script, and the audiences loved it. Newspapers of the time frequently reported on who dined with whom, what was served, and whether or not the table settings impressed the aristocracy. Yes, Edwardian gossip columns included the thrilling headline equivalent of Lord So-and-so ate oysters last night. Imagine TMZ, but with more sauce boats and fewer scandals involving fast cars. The Edwardian table wasn't just about luxury, it was about order. Everything had a place, and everyone had a rank. Your seat at the table told you exactly where you belonged in the social ladder. If you were seated near the host or hostess, congratulations, you mattered. If you were seated down at the end next to Uncle Gerald, who only talks about beetroot farming, better luck next season. In many ways, a dinner party was like a live-action flowchart of social importance. And the dinners themselves, they weren't quick affairs. You didn't pop in for an hour, eat and go home. No, Edwardian dinners were marathons of endurance. Multiple courses stretched into late hours, wine flowed freely, and polite conversation was required even if you were dying of indigestion. This was dining as sport, where the strongest survived the marathon of fish, game, puddings and port. The good news, you were eating. The bad news, you weren't allowed to leave until the host said so. The obsession wasn't confined to the elite aristocracy either. The wealthy middle class was desperate to imitate these grand affairs, even if they couldn't quite pull them off. For them, a dinner party wasn't just about food, it was a ticket into society. Fail to host properly, and you'd risk social obscurity. It's hard to imagine today, but back then, a botched dinner could ruin reputations faster than a bad tweet. And oh, the pressure on the hosts. Edwardians treated entertaining as a competitive sport. The rival family down the street served oysters. You'd better serve oysters and caviar. They had a pianist. You'd better have a full-string quartet. A host who failed to impress might as well have served boiled cabbage and been done with it. Social status was fragile, and the dinner table was both battlefield and catwalk. But here's the kicker. Despite all this formality and pomp, Edwardian dinner parties weren't always elegant in reality. Behind the chandeliers, the gowns, and the sparkling conversation, there were mishaps galore. Dishes went cold, glasses broke, servants tripped, and guests sometimes had too much port and made a fool of themselves. Yet the show always went on, because that's what dinner was, a show, and everyone, no matter how sweaty or stuffed, had to pretend they were having the time of their lives. Of course, none of this would matter if the Edwardians hadn't turned dining into a cultural obsession. They built an entire social system around mealtime. Invitations carried weight. Seating charts were engineered like military strategies. Tableware companies thrived. Cookbooks became bestsellers. The dinner party wasn't just about food, it was an industry, a marketplace of status, and the defining entertainment of the era. And so, as we take our seats at this grand Edwardian table, let's remember You're not here for the food, not really. You're here to be seen, to prove your worth, and to hope you don't embarrass yourself when faced with yet another spoon you've never seen before. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was an Olympic sport for people with too much cutlery. In Edwardian Britain, the dinner party was less about what was on the table and more about who was allowed to sit at it. Forget the menu for a moment. An Edwardian dinner was first and foremost a test of social ranking. Who got an invitation wasn't just a casual choice, it was a chess move in a very high-stakes game of reputation, wealth and power. To be left off the list? That wasn't just disappointing, it was practically a social death sentence. If you weren't on the guest list, you might as well eat your gruel in shame. The Edwardians lived in a world where status was a visible currency, and dinner parties were the perfect way to spend it. An invitation wasn't just a piece of heavy cardstock embossed with curlicues. It was a badge of honour, a passport into polite society. To receive one meant you mattered, or at least you were useful to someone who did. Invitations were not handed out like sweets. They were carefully curated, weighed, and analysed, often with more effort than Parliament put into passing actual laws. The hierarchy of invites began, of course, with the aristocracy. Dukes, earls, lords and ladies had a guaranteed place at the table, their noble blood practically dripping onto the linen tablecloths. Then came the newly rich, the industrialists, financiers and railway magnates who had more money than most of the aristocracy, but none of the pedigree. These parvenus desperately sought invitations, for they knew that their piles of cash meant nothing if they couldn't secure a place among the titled elite. For the old nobility, inviting them was a delicate question. Yes, they had money, but did they know which spoon to use? One wrong slurp could send shockwaves through the entire room. The middle classes, too, longed for a way in. Lawyers, doctors and successful shop owners might claw their way up the social ladder, and a dinner party invite was often their reward. But hosts had to tread carefully. Invite too many middle-class climbers, and your evening suddenly reeked of ambition rather than elegance. The balance had to be just right, enough blue-blooded guests to impress, enough wealthy newcomers to keep the wine flowing, and maybe a celebrity writer or artist to add a dash of culture. Yes, artists and intellectuals were often sprinkled into the mix, not because the Edwardians really cared what they had to say, but because it looked fashionable to have a painter or poet sitting near the soup tureen. Oscar Wilde had made it fashionable in the previous generation, and hosts still chased after the clever set to show off their cultural awareness. Of course, whether anyone actually listened to them between bites of pheasant is another matter. But don't think for a second that everyone who wanted to attend could. The Edwardians were ruthless gatekeepers. Invitations could be rescinded at the faintest whiff of scandal. A family's daughter had run off with a stable boy. No soup for you. Your husband was caught in a financial scandal. Off the list. Even minor faux pas like being overly friendly at the wrong event or daring to criticise the wrong opera could land you in social exile. Edwardian hosts weren't just inviting guests, they were curating reputations. The invitations themselves were productions. They were handwritten or printed on thick, creamy cardstock that looked more expensive than most people's rent. Delivery was handled with ceremony, sometimes via liveried footmen, as if you were receiving a royal decree rather than an invite to eat mutton. And if you received such an envelope, you were expected to respond with equal ceremony. A hasty, sloppy acceptance note could make you look uncouth. A delayed response could get you scratched off the list entirely. Edwardians invented the RSVP arms race, and failure to comply made you socially radioactive. For those not invited, the consequences were brutal. Dinner parties were reported in the society pages, with names listed like a roll call of the chosen. If your name didn't appear, people noticed. Whispers spread quickly. Why weren't the Thompsons there? Have they lost money? Did their son say something dreadful at the last soiree? It was less about missing dinner and more about missing visibility. Not being invited meant you were vanishing, socially speaking, and in Edwardian Britain, vanishing was worse than death. It was obscurity. Of course, for those on the fringes, there was always hope. Strategic networking could land you a coveted spot. A well-placed compliment, a shared charity project, or a marriage alliance could shift fortunes dramatically. Invitations were, in many ways, tickets to climb. Every dinner party had its hopefuls, people invited for the first time, teetering on the edge of acceptance. For them, this was no casual night out. It was a career-defining performance. Use the wrong fork and you might never be invited back. Charm the right duchess and you could change your family's social destiny. So when we talk about Edwardian dinner parties, remember, the obsession began before the soup even hit the table. The real drama played out in the scramble for invitations. Guests didn't just attend dinners, they fought to exist in the spotlight of the guest list. And if you were unlucky enough to miss out, enjoy your lonely bowl of stew while your neighbours clink glasses across candlelit tables, secure in the knowledge that they belonged and you didn't. Because in Edwardian Britain, dinner was more than food. It was the ultimate social scoreboard, and if you weren't on it, you weren't anyone. Before an Edwardian dinner party guest even sniffed the soup tureen, there was another ordeal waiting, the outfit. Forget food. Fashion was the first test. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a runway show, and the dress code wasn't optional. In Edwardian Britain, showing up underdressed was the equivalent of arriving at the Oscars in pyjamas. People would talk, they would whisper, and your reputation would be folded and packed away quicker than your cravat. For men, things seemed deceptively simple. Formal evening dress, that meant black tailcoats with silk lapels, starched white shirts, crisp white waistcoats, and a bow tie so stiff it could probably double as body armour. Edwardian men were, in essence, penguins with pocket watches. They were expected to look identical because originality in male dress was frowned upon. The point wasn't to stand out, but to prove you understood the rules. Your shoes had to gleam, your hair had to behave, and your cufflinks had better not look cheap. God forbid you confused a white tie occasion with a black tie one. You might as well tattoo social catastrophe on your forehead. Women, meanwhile, had the far harder task. Edwardian gowns were feats of engineering, made with more layers than a geological cross-section. First came the camise and drawers, then the corset, then the petticoats, then the gown itself. By the time she was fully dressed, the average Edwardian woman had essentially installed scaffolding under her clothes. Fashion dictated the famous S-bend silhouette, thanks to corsets that thrust the chest forward and the hips back, making every dinner party resemble a roomful of swans attempting yoga. And don't forget the materials: silk, satin, lace, velvet. Sometimes all on the same dress. The more fabric, the better. Skirts trailed across carpets, sleeves ballooned, bodices sparkled. If the candles reflected properly off your sequins, you might just outshine the dessert. The goal was to look like a walking chandelier, but with enough dignity to carry on polite conversation. Accessories were another battlefield. Gloves were mandatory. No respectable Edwardian woman would be caught shaking hands bare-fingered. Pearls and diamonds glittered on necks. Tiaras occasionally appeared, and handbags, tiny delicate things, carried nothing of practical value. Heaven forbid anyone tried to smuggle in something useful like a sandwich for later. Hair was its own performance. Women's hairstyles were piled high, teased, curled and decorated with feathers, combs or jewelled pins. Some styles were so tall that a lady's most pressing concern at dinner was not stabbing her neighbour with a hatpin. Men's grooming was equally strict. Moustaches were waxed, beards trimmed, hair parted with military precision. If you showed up looking like you'd just wrestled a hedgehog, you wouldn't make it past the coat room. And then there was the question of comfort, or rather, the lack of it. Edwardians wore so many layers by the time you reached dessert you had lost 5 pounds in sweat. Corsets restricted breathing so much that fainting was practically a dinner party sport. Gloves made it nearly impossible to pick up anything smaller than a serving spoon, and tailcoats were cut so tight you couldn't slouch even if you desperately wanted to. Edwardian fashion wasn't about comfort, it was about discipline, self-control and suffering beautifully. This obsession with dress was more than vanity. It was social armour. Your outfit was your ticket into society. A man in a slightly shabby coat might be dismissed as not quite the thing. A woman with last season's gown risked whispers about financial trouble. Dress codes reinforced class. Aristocrats wore gowns custom-made in Paris. The nouveau rich might try to imitate, but often got it wrong, signalling their lack of breeding. Fashion was a language, and one misstep in vocabulary could expose you as an imposter. And the preparation. Dressing for a dinner party wasn't a quick shower and throw something on. For women, it could take hours of being laced, pinned, powdered, and fussed over by maids. For men, valet services ensured every shirt was ironed within an inch of its life. Whole households went into battle mode just to get their masters and mistresses ready to face the dining room. If you've ever felt stressed about picking out clothes for a wedding, imagine living in a world where that stress happened every single Thursday night. Of course, the spectacle didn't end at the door. Once everyone was seated, the dinner party doubled as a fashion show. Guests subtly, or not so subtly, judged each other's outfits. Compliments were currency, but criticism was sharper than any carving knife. "Oh, what a lovely gown," might actually mean, "I see you couldn't afford Worth of Paris this season." Clothing was communication, and everyone at the table was fluent. In the end, Edwardian dress codes remind us that dinner parties weren't about eating. They were about being seen. Hosts decorated their tables, yes, but they also decorated their guests. The dining room became a gallery, each gown and tailcoat a painting, every accessory another brushstroke in the portrait of Edwardian society. So when you imagine yourself at one of these dinners, don't picture yourself lounging comfortably in your favourite jeans. Picture yourself strapped into a corset, balancing feathers on your head, sweating under velvet sleeves and praying no one notices you're wearing last year's cufflinks. Because in Edwardian Britain, the greatest corset served at dinner wasn't soup or pheasant or pudding. It was fashion, garnished with judgment. If you think arriving at an Edwardian dinner party was as simple as walking through the front door, handing over your coat and sniffing out the roast beef, think again. In Edwardian Britain, even showing up was a performance. Guests didn't just arrive, they entered. And how you managed that entrance could determine whether you were remembered as a sparkling jewel of society or as that poor fellow who tripped on the carpet. First, there was the carriage ballet. Streets outside grand town houses often became clogged with horse-drawn carriages, each jostling for position as liveried footmen opened doors with rehearsed flourish. This was your first impression. If your carriage looked shabby or your coachman's livery wasn't up to snuff, the neighbours noticed. Arrival wasn't simply transportation, it was a parade. Nothing screamed failure louder than turning up late in a muddy cab while the rest of the guests swept in like royalty. Then came the threshold moment, stepping out of the carriage and into the home. For women, this meant negotiating long skirts and high heels on cobblestones without face planting. For men, it meant offering an arm at precisely the right angle, not too casual and not too stiff. The wrong gait could undo all your carefully starched dignity. Inside, footmen whisked away coats, cloaks and fur stoles with mechanical precision, making sure guests emerged looking as if they had just floated in from Olympus. But the real test began in the receiving line. The hosts waited in the entrance hall, often beneath gilt-framed portraits of ancestors glaring down as if to say, "Don't embarrass us." Guests were expected to approach in turn, bow or curtsy, and offer the right form of greeting. "Delighted to be here" was fine. A lady's curtsy was even more complicated, requiring balance, poise, and just enough knee bend to seem elegant. One wobble, and you risked going down like a felled oak tree, remembered forever as the one who toppled into the umbrella stand. After greeting the hosts, the next ordeal was being announced. A liveried servant, often a butler, would declare each guest as they entered the drawing room. This wasn't just about courtesy, it was a spotlight moment. Lord and Lady Pembroke rang out, and all eyes turned. If your name carried weight, the room reacted accordingly. If you were lesser known, the silence afterward was deafening. And heaven help you if the servant mispronounced your name. Being introduced as Mr. Smudgebottom instead of Mr. Smythebottom could haunt you for the rest of the season. The drawing room, where guests gathered before dinner, was its own minefield. You had to mingle with just the right people, neither clinging awkwardly to the wallpaper, nor monopolising the host. Seating was limited, so hovering with a sherry in hand while pretending not to sweat was an art form. This was when you performed your pre-dinner networking. A few pleasantries here, a comment on the weather there, all while scanning the room to see who had made the cut. It was like Edwardian speed dating, but with more lace and less honesty. Timing was crucial. Arrive too early, and you risked looking over-eager, like a child waiting for birthday cake. Arrive too late, and you disrupted the delicate choreography of arrivals, perhaps forcing the host to explain why dinner had been delayed for your sake. The golden rule was to appear fashionably on time, just late enough to seem important, but not so late that the soup curdled in resentment. And yes, even the small details mattered. Gloves had to be removed at the right moment. Not too early, or you looked vulgar. Not too late, or you looked clueless. Walking sticks and fans had to be managed gracefully. One wrong move, dropping a hat pin or whacking someone with your cane, and the memory of your entrance lingered far longer than any clever anecdote you offered at dessert. Arrival etiquette wasn't about comfort or ease. It was about control, precision, and hierarchy. Everything reinforced status, the order in which guests were announced, the tone of greetings, even the physical path you took through the room. The hosts engineered it like stage directors, ensuring the important people mingled near the fireplace while the less significant hovered by the door. Of course, behind all the polished smiles, many guests loathed this ordeal. The pressure to perform was enormous, and one slip could ripple across society like a pebble in a pond. But that was the Edwardian dinner party in a nutshell, a place where every moment, even the arrival, carried weight. So imagine yourself standing in line, rehearsing your bow, clutching your calling card, praying the butler doesn't butcher your name, and trying not to trip over the rug. Congratulations, you've survived the first 5 minutes. Only 4 more hours of tests await. Step beyond the drawing room, past the flurry of greetings and the clink of sherry glasses, and you enter the true temple of Edwardian society, the dining room. This was not simply a place to eat. It was a stage, a battlefield, and sometimes a psychological trap, all disguised with heavy draperies and candlelight. The Edwardians treated their dining rooms like a blend of art gallery and throne room. Every inch was meant to communicate one thing: power. The Edwardian dining room was typically the grandest room in the house, second only to the ballroom. Oak-panelled walls, heavy velvet curtains, and ceilings that seemed to reach toward heaven created an atmosphere of solemnity, as though dining were a sacred rite. And in a way, it was. This was where reputations were made or unmade, where alliances were whispered over roast beef, and where someone's future could hinge on whether they impressed the right person between the soup and the fish course. Furniture played its role in this theatre. The dining table was the centrepiece, long, heavy, and polished until it reflected candlelight like a mirror. It wasn't just a table, it was a platform for displaying wealth. Silver candelabras, porcelain centerpieces, elaborate flower arrangements, sometimes taller than the guests, turned the middle of the table into a miniature jungle of excess. You weren't just eating across from someone, you were peering at them through a forest of roses, ferns, and candlesticks. And then there were the chairs. High-backed, sturdy, and often uncomfortable, they were designed less for lounging and more for keeping you upright, alert, and painfully aware of your posture. Guests sat in rigid lines like schoolchildren on their best behaviour. Slouching wasn't just frowned upon, it was practically a scandal. If the food didn't give you indigestion, the chairs certainly tried their best. But the real drama of the Edwardian dining room wasn't in the wallpaper or the chairs, it was in the seating arrangements. Where you sat mattered immensely. Placement at the table was a coded message about your rank in the host's social universe. The closer you were to the host, the more important you were, or the more likely to choke on a fishbone under pressure. Those seats signalled influence, intimacy, and status. Being exiled to the far end of the table near the drafty windows and distant from conversation told everyone you were a social afterthought. Hosts obsessed over seating charts with the precision of military commanders. Friendships, rivalries, potential scandals, all had to be managed. You didn't want 2 people who despised each other locked in a polite duel across a soup bowl. Nor did you want to risk placing someone of high rank next to a social nobody. The balance was delicate. Aristocrats had to be flattered, wealthy guests had to be acknowledged, and everyone else had to be kept busy enough not to feel slighted. A bad seating chart could derail the evening faster than a burnt soufflé. Architecture reinforced the hierarchy. The host and hostess usually sat at opposite ends of the table, like monarchs surveying their kingdoms. From there, the social ripples extended outward. The most prestigious guests sat near them, radiating importance. Lesser ranks drifted down the sides, until the unlucky few at the far corners might as well have been eating in the scullery. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone judged accordingly. To be promoted to a better seat at the next party was a triumph. To be demoted was humiliation in oak-panelled form. Even the decor whispered judgment. Portraits of ancestors hung on the walls, their painted eyes gazing sternly down as if monitoring your etiquette. Gilded frames and grand sideboards piled with silver emphasized the wealth of the household. Carpets muffled footsteps, but not the rustle of silk skirts or the nervous clearing of throats. Everything in the room conspired to remind you, this wasn't just dinner, It was a test of your place in society. And then there was the lighting. Electric light had begun to creep into wealthy homes, but many Edwardian hosts still relied on chandeliers dripping with candles. The effect was dramatic, flickering flames casting golden light over polished silver and glassware, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts dazzling and suffocating. In that glow, every bead of sweat, every awkward glance, every nervous fumble with a knife was illuminated for the entire table to see. Dinner wasn't eaten in the shadows, it was consumed under a spotlight. For servants, the dining room was a backstage nightmare. They moved silently along the edges of the room, refilling glasses, serving courses, and whisking away plates with choreography so precise it might as well have been a ballet. Guests weren't supposed to notice, but they did always. A dropped spoon or clumsy footstep could puncture the illusion of elegance, and heaven help the poor servant who disrupted the performance. To modernise, the Edwardian dining room might seem oppressive, almost theatrical to the point of absurdity, but for the Edwardians, it was everything. It was where the rituals of class played out in their purest form. It was where luxury was displayed and judged. It was where people measured themselves against their peers, not by conversation alone, but by the invisible mathematics of where they sat, what they saw, and who saw them. So when you picture the Edwardian dining room, don't imagine a cosy family meal. Picture a cavernous chamber heavy with velvet, a gleaming table crowded with silver and flowers, portraits glaring down from the walls, and 30 guests arranged like chess pieces. You're seated somewhere along the polished oak battlefield, desperately trying to look important while silently praying you don't spill gravy on the tablecloth. Because in the Edwardian dining room, gravy wasn't just sauce, it was potential social suicide. Before a single oyster or pheasant breast appeared, before anyone worried about seating charts or fainted in a corset, the Edwardian dining experience began with something both beautiful and terrifying: the table setting. For us today, setting the table means plonking down a fork, knife, and maybe a spoon if soup is on the menu. But for Edwardians, it was a Herculean task. Their table wasn't a place to eat, it was a stage, and the silverware, plates and glasses were the props. Imagine walking into a dining room and seeing an oak table so loaded with cutlery, crystal and porcelain that there's barely room left for your actual dinner. Each place setting was a glittering battlefield, fork upon fork, knife upon knife, spoon upon spoon, like a miniature army ready to march against your hunger. And heaven help you if you picked up the wrong weapon. One wrong fork choice and you might trigger a social Armageddon. The forks alone could give you nightmares. There was a fish fork, a meat fork, a salad fork, a dessert fork, and because life wasn't hard enough, a pastry fork, with a curious little notch on the side that confused even seasoned diners. Knives came in similar abundance. Fish knives with odd shapes, butter knives with rounded tips, carving knives for larger courses, and dessert knives smaller than all the rest. Each one had a designated role, and woe betide the guest who buttered bread with the fish knife. That single misstep was the Edwardian equivalent of spilling secrets on Twitter. Glasses were another matter. At each setting, a small fleet of crystal goblets sparkled under the candlelight, each one assigned to a different wine or spirit. Sherry, claret, champagne, port. The list went on. Hosts sometimes arranged up to 6 glasses per guest, creating a shimmering forest of stemware that threatened to topple with the faintest elbow bump. Choosing the wrong glass could expose your ignorance, like trying to drink soup with a fork. Servants stood by to refill each in proper order, so all you had to do was remember which glass was which, maintain witty conversation, and not pass out by the 7th refill. Easy. Plates were no less intimidating. Dinner began with the service plate, sometimes called a charger, a large decorative plate that never held food itself but served as a sort of foundation. Smaller plates were layered on top as courses came and went, each whisked away by servants with balletic grace. The sheer choreography of plate swapping was remarkable. As one plate disappeared, another magically appeared in its place, like a porcelain sleight of hand act. Then came the centerpieces. No Edwardian table was complete without an extravagant display of flowers, fruit, or even elaborate sugar sculptures. Some centerpieces were so tall and bushy they practically formed hedges between guests. You might have attended an entire dinner without ever seeing the person opposite you, which was perhaps a blessing if conversation flagged. Centerpieces weren't just decoration, they were declarations of wealth and taste. The more exotic the flowers, the more your guests knew you could afford hothouse orchids in December. Candles, or later, electric lights designed to look like candles, completed the scene. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, silver candelabras glowed on the table, and the effect was part fairy tale, part interrogation chamber. Every twitch of your eyebrow, every drop of sweat, every hesitant glance at the cutlery lineup was illuminated for the whole table to see. And then there was the tablecloth, a pristine white cloth, often embroidered or damask, cascaded down to the floor, concealing the table's legs and ensuring no guest was reminded that, beneath all the finery, they were just eating off wood like ordinary mortals. Tablecloths had to be immaculate. One stain, one crease, and the hostess's dignity could unravel faster than a bad soufflé. Napkins were folded with military precision, sometimes into elaborate shapes like fans or even birds, because nothing says relax and enjoy your dinner like origami fabric perched beside your soup spoon. All of this didn't happen by accident. Behind the scenes, armies of servants measured, polished, and positioned everything with exacting detail. Forks had to be placed equidistant from each other, knives aligned with obsessive precision, glasses arranged in straight lines like crystal soldiers. The table was a battlefield where symmetry fought against chaos, and chaos was never allowed to win. To a newcomer, it was overwhelming. Guests unfamiliar with the rules often panicked, watching their neighbours like hawks to figure out which fork to use next. The golden rule was to work your way inward, start with the cutlery farthest from the plate and move in as the courses progressed. But under the pressure of candlelight, judging eyes, and a waiter hovering at your elbow, even the simplest rule could slip your mind. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were memorable. Entire reputations could be built or broken on the misplacement of a spoon. In the end, the Edwardian table setting wasn't about convenience or practicality, it was about theatre. Every fork, every glass, every centrepiece screamed, "Look at me! Look at how much effort, money, and taste this dinner represents." Guests were meant to feel awed, impressed, and slightly terrified. And if you left dinner with indigestion, at least you also left with the memory of having survived one of society's most nerve-wracking obstacle courses. So next time you toss a fork and knife beside your plate and call it a day, remember, the Edwardians would faint at your casualness. For them, setting the table was nothing less than art, and an art with very sharp edges. If Edwardian dinner parties were a dazzling performance, then the guests were merely the audience. The real stars hidden in plain sight were the servants. Dinner wasn't eaten, it was stage-managed like a West End production. Every flicker of candlelight, every gleaming fork, every steaming dish of pheasant owed its existence to the silent, frantic, and often back-breaking work of the people below stairs. First among them was the butler, the conductor of this social orchestra. The butler was more than a glorified wine pourer. He was the nerve centre of the household. He oversaw timing, ensured servants didn't trip over each other, and maintained the illusion that the entire dinner unfolded with magical effortlessness. Guests saw calm, the butler saw chaos. He was a master of discretion, able to glide through the room, refill a glass and vanish again without so much as a cough. Think of him as the stage manager who could make or break the evening, except instead of yelling into a headset, he quietly signalled footmen with discreet nods and eyebrow twitches. Then came the footmen, dressed in liveries so polished they practically reflected the candlelight. Their role was both practical and decorative, carrying dishes, pulling out chairs, and generally existing as human wallpaper in powdered wigs. Footmen were chosen for their height and appearance, ideally tall, well-built and symmetrical, because apparently even the soup course looked better when delivered by a handsome man. They stood like statues along the walls until summoned, moving only when needed. When they did, it was with clockwork precision, plates in hand, synchronized like dancers. Watching them serve was less like dining, and more like attending a ballet choreographed with gravy boats. Meanwhile, the maids were rarely seen by the guests, but played vital roles in preparation. Long before the first guest arrived, maids were ironing table linens, polishing silver until it blinded the eye, and carrying endless supplies of firewood, candles, and flowers into the dining room. They were the unseen hands that made luxury appear effortless. Their absence during dinner wasn't neglect, it was strategy. Too many servants on stage spoiled the illusion, so the maid's work was largely invisible, though indispensable. And then there was the kitchen staff. Here lay the real battlefield. The Edwardian kitchen was a hive of activity, chefs barking orders, scullery maids scrubbing pans the size of cauldrons, and ovens roaring with heat. Timing was everything. If the roast was late, the soup too cool, or the fish overcooked, the entire evening might collapse into farce. Head cooks ran their domain with military authority, organising armies of assistants to chop, stir and plate with ruthless efficiency. Guests upstairs might politely sip their sherry, but downstairs the kitchen staff was sweating through their aprons like marathon runners, praying the soufflé wouldn't collapse at the exact wrong moment. The handoff between kitchen and dining room was the trickiest part of the operation. Dishes had to be carried upstairs, kept warm and served in precise sequence. Too fast and guests felt rushed. Too slow and awkward silences spread like a plague. The butler acted as the traffic controller, signalling when to advance with the next course. Imagine a dozen servants lurking in the shadows, plates balanced, waiting for the moment the butler's nod released them like greyhounds from the gate. And don't forget the wine service. Edwardian dining demanded a parade of wines to match each course, and the butler had to manage this with flawless timing. Footmen poured with practiced elegance, ensuring no glass was empty, but also never overfilled. Wine was to flow generously, but never sloppily. One drip down the side of a glass could feel like a scandal. It was hospitality as a high-wire act, indulgent but precise, abundant yet controlled. The entire spectacle required absolute silence. Servants were to be invisible, present, but never obtrusive. No chatter, no clumsy coughs, no clattering plates. Guests often pretended servants didn't exist at all, even though those very servants were making the entire illusion possible. It was a peculiar social hypocrisy. Guests basked in elegance, while willfully ignoring the sweat and effort that created it. Behind the scenes, however, servants lived with relentless pressure. A single mistake, spilling sauce, misplacing a dish, announcing the wrong wine, could result in reprimand, humiliation or dismissal. Dinner parties were as nerve-wracking for servants as they were for guests, if not more. After all, the guests risked embarrassment. The servants risked their livelihoods. It's easy to forget that what looked seamless upstairs was chaos downstairs. Bells rang constantly, orders barked, trays crashed. Scullery maids worked until their hands bled from scrubbing. Kitchen boys dashed about fetching ingredients. The glamour of the Edwardian table rested on the exhaustion of dozens of people whose names were never printed in the society pages. And yet, for all this effort, the servants rarely ate the food they so carefully presented. They dined separately, later, often on leftovers if there were any. To them, the 10-course extravaganza was not a pleasure, but a performance for which they would never receive applause. So while Edwardian dinner guests reclined in high-backed chairs, congratulating themselves on their charm and sophistication, remember the invisible cast who made it possible. Dinner wasn't just served, it was orchestrated. The clink of crystal glasses, the timely arrival of each course, the endless parade of silver platters, it was all a dance, choreographed below stairs and performed above with military precision. Without the servants, there would be no dinner party. There would only be chaos, cold soup and social ruin. And that, perhaps, is the true secret of Edwardian dining. The guests thought they were the stars, but the servants ran the show. After all the bows, all the liveried footmen and all the silent glaring from ancestors in oil paintings, the moment finally arrived, the first course. This was where the true drama of the Edwardian dinner began, not with pheasants or puddings, but with the humble soup and its companions. And let me be clear, this wasn't soup as we know it today, slurped in pyjamas on a Tuesday night. No, Edwardian soup was an ordeal, a performance, and sometimes a survival test. Soup wasn't food, it was a test of whether you could slurp without sounding like a walrus. The soup course was almost always the opener. Clear broths, delicate consommes, or light vegetable soups often arrived first, served in porcelain bowls so fine you were terrified of breaking them just by looking too hard. This wasn't hearty stew ladled from a pot. It was carefully strained liquid designed to look elegant. Some soups were so thin they seemed more like flavoured water than sustenance. But that was the point. It wasn't about filling you up. It was about pacing the marathon. A 10-course dinner had to start with something light, or at least something that looked refined when you raised it delicately to your lips. And here's where the trouble began. Edwardian etiquette dictated how you ate the soup. You couldn't just dive in. No, you had to tilt the spoon away from you, not toward you, and sip silently from the side, not the front. Heaven help you if you made noise. A single slurp could echo down the polished oak table like a cannon blast. Worse, if you attempted to cool the soup by blowing on it, you risked being remembered forever as the barbarian who treated consommé like porridge. This was dining as minefield, one spoonful at a time. Of course, not all soups were equal. Some houses prided themselves on exotic recipes. Mock turtle soup, for example, which used calf's head to mimic the expensive taste of real turtle. Others favoured bisques, thick with cream and seafood. For the wealthy, importing ingredients for unusual soups was another way to flex. Saffron from Spain, spices from India, rare vegetables cultivated in hothouses. The soup bowl carried not just broth but a declaration of global reach. Starters, or hors d'oeuvres, often followed or accompanied the soup. These were small, delicate items meant to whet the appetite. Oysters, dressed salads, or tiny meat patties might appear on silver trays. Again, it wasn't about substance, it was about spectacle. A starter was there to impress, not to feed. After all, no Edwardian wanted to spoil their appetite before the main parade of meats and fish arrived. The irony? For many working-class Britons of the time, a plate of soup and bread would have been an entire meal, while the Edwardians saw it as a warm-up lap. The service of the soup itself was another performance. Servants presented it with the precision of surgeons, ladling just the right amount into each bowl, ensuring no drips marred the pristine tablecloth. Guests had to wait until everyone was served before lifting a spoon, creating a brief but nerve-wracking pause as 30 pairs of eyes hovered over 30 bowls of steaming liquid. It was less bon appetit and more synchronized spoon choreography. And then came the conversational challenge. Eating soup while maintaining sparkling small talk was no easy feat. Try balancing a delicate spoon, aiming for silence, and still contributing witty remarks about the latest opera. Many guests resorted to nodding politely mid-sip, risking dribbles and awkward pauses. Soup demanded absolute concentration, leaving conversation to falter until the bowls were cleared. For hosts, the opening course set the tone. A perfect soup could start the evening on a note of refinement. A bad one could doom the dinner before it began. Too salty, too bland, too cold, disaster. Even the temperature mattered. If soup arrived lukewarm, guests might politely endure it, but they would also whisper later about the hostess's inability to maintain standards. One spoiled consommé, and months of careful planning could unravel faster than a lace glove caught on a fork tine. It's worth remembering that for all its elegance, soup carried hazards. Spills were common, especially with trailing sleeves or nervous hands. A splash of hot liquid on satin was more than a fashion mishap. It was a social catastrophe. And with multiple servants bustling about, the odds of a soup-laden tray wobbling at the wrong moment were high. Somewhere in Edwardian Britain, a footman's entire career probably ended in a shower of broth. But for those who navigated the soup successfully, there was a reward of sorts, the knowledge that they had survived the opening test. No slurps, no spills, no embarrassing noises. The bowls were whisked away, the table reset with new silver, and the dinner marched onward. The guests could relax, at least until the fish course arrived to torment them with bones. The opening course may seem trivial, but in Edwardian society it was critical. It was the moment that established whether the evening would glide smoothly or descend into whispered mockery. Soup was more than food, it was a ritual of control, restraint and etiquette. And if you made it through without sounding like a walrus, you had already won half the battle. If the soup course was the polite handshake of an Edwardian dinner party, the heavy courses were the bear hug that threatened to crush your ribs. Once the delicate consommés and dainty starters had lulled guests into a false sense of security, the table transformed into a parade of animal protein so vast it made Noah's Ark look understocked. This was the moment when restraint gave way to abundance, when guests realised they weren't just dining, they were auditioning for an endurance contest. If your artery survived Edwardian dinners, congratulations, you cheated death. The fish course traditionally came first in this marathon. Fish had been a staple of upper-class dining for centuries, but the Edwardians turned it into an art form. In salmon, turbot or sole often appeared, swimming in sauces with names more complicated than their ingredients. Hollandaise, bechamel and caper sauces flowed across porcelain platters. Each dish a little too rich for comfort. Bones were the true villains here, lurking like aquatic landmines. Guests had to extract morsels with delicate precision. praying they didn't choke in front of the Duchess seated 2 places away. For the less dexterous, the fish knife, curved, flat, and slightly absurd, was the only hope. Heaven forbid you stabbed the fish like a barbarian. Once the fish was cleared, the meat procession began. Roasts dominated the Edwardian table. Beef, mutton, lamb, venison, sometimes all in the same evening. Hosts competed to serve the finest cuts, often displaying entire joints of meat carved dramatically by servants at side tables. It wasn't just about eating, it was about spectacle. A perfectly roasted haunch of venison was as much a status symbol as the chandelier above your head. Game meats also featured prominently. Pheasant, partridge, grouse and hare made frequent appearances, often roasted whole and carried in with a flourish. Some dishes were served in casserole, others flambéed, and all of them drowned in sauces thick enough to double as wallpaper paste. The Edwardians loved richness. Cream, butter, wine and stock reduced until they clung to the meat like edible velvet. Calories weren't counted, they were celebrated. And then there was poultry. Turkey, duck and goose all strutted onto the Edwardian table, sometimes stuffed with force meats, so elaborate they resembled culinary Russian dolls. A duck might be stuffed with veal, which was stuffed with truffles, which was then wrapped in pastry and drowned in sauce. The point wasn't to nourish, it was to overwhelm. A modern nutritionist would faint on sight. Carving was its own ritual. A skilled carver could transform a daunting roast into neat, manageable slices with the grace of a surgeon. Watching them was half the entertainment, but one slip of the knife and gravy might cascade across the tablecloth like a culinary crime scene. Carving wasn't just kitchen work, it was performance art, and guests judged it as keenly as they judged each other's gowns. Vegetables, technically present, were little more than afterthoughts. Boiled potatoes, peas, and asparagus appeared on side dishes. But they weren't the stars, they were the supporting cast, dragged on stage to make the meat look even more heroic. Fibre wasn't fashionable, fat was. Guests piled their plates high, knowing full well they would regret it later, but refusing to show weakness in the face of roasted abundance. Of course, the sheer volume of food posed challenges. A 10-course dinner could easily overwhelm even the hardiest eater. Yet etiquette demanded that you at least sample each dish. Refusing a course outright was practically an insult to the host. This led to the peculiar Edwardian art of pretending to enjoy food while secretly strategizing about stomach space. The trick was to eat just enough to seem appreciative without filling yourself too early. Many a guest likely spent the evening wishing for an emergency corset release valve. And let's not forget the health consequences. Gout, indigestion, and high blood pressure were practically badges of honour among the Edwardian elite. Doctors warned against overeating, but no one listened. Instead, they joked about it, masking discomfort with polite laughter and extra brandy. If modern gym memberships are about burning calories, Edwardian dining was about earning them, one haunch of venison at a time. The heavy courses also revealed the competitive nature of hosting. One host's roast beef could not merely equal another's, it had to surpass it. Imported spices, rare wines in sauces, even the quality of the carving knives was subject to scrutiny. Dinner was war, fought with meat and gravy instead of swords and cannons. To attend such a dinner was to witness an arms race in roast form. By the time the heavy courses ended, guests were already loosening belts discreetly beneath the table. Servants whisked away plates piled with bones, half-eaten game, and sauces congealing in the candlelight. Yet no one dared admit defeat. Everyone smiled, complimented the cooking, and braced themselves for the next onslaught. After all, Edwardian dining wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. So picture yourself at that table, fish knife in hand, sweat beading on your forehead, as yet another platter of roast mutton glistens under the candles. Your stomach begs for mercy, your arteries wave little white flags, but you carry on. Because in Edwardian Britain, survival wasn't about running marathons or climbing mountains, it was about enduring meat course number 3 without collapsing into your soup spoon. If the Edwardians loved anything more than their roasts and puddings, it was showing off the fact that their food didn't come from around the corner, it came from across the globe. Dinner parties were not just a test of etiquette, they were an edible map of the British Empire. Why settle for potatoes when you could flex with a mango that cost more than your servant's yearly wage? At the height of the empire, Britain had access to an astonishing range of foods from far-off colonies. Hosting a dinner party meant proving you could reach beyond your local butcher or greengrocer and tap into global trade routes. Exotic imports were trophies, paraded on silver platters as proof of both wealth and worldliness. It wasn't enough to serve meat and pudding. You had to remind your guests that your pineapple had sailed across an ocean just for them. The pineapple, in particular, was the crown jewel of imported foods. Originally so rare that families would rent one as a table decoration, by the Edwardian era pineapples were more available, but still considered wildly impressive. To slice into one during dessert was to announce, "I have money, I have taste, and I have access to a shipping network that brings tropical fruit to my frosty British doorstep." Pineapples often occupied the centre of dessert displays, towering above cakes and pastries like edible royalty. Spices told a similar story. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, nutmeg from the West Indies. These were culinary treasures that transformed ordinary dishes into exotic luxuries. A venison stew wasn't just venison stew if you added cloves imported from Zanzibar. It was a statement of sophistication. The average Edwardian household didn't sprinkle cardamom on rice pudding, but if you wanted to outshine your rivals, you made sure your pudding had the scent of far-off places. To dine in an Edwardian home was to taste the empire in every bite. Tea, of course, was ever present, though it had migrated from afternoon parlours into post-dinner rituals. The leaves came from India or Ceylon, and their presence reminded everyone that Britain's influence stretched far beyond the dining room. Sugar, too, often sourced from Caribbean plantations, sweetened the elaborate desserts. Few stopped to think about the labour that made these luxuries possible. The Edwardians were too busy congratulating themselves on their refined palates. And then there was wine. French vintages remained the gold standard, but Edwardian hosts also prided themselves on showcasing bottles from Germany, Spain, or even further afield. Champagne was obligatory at any grand dinner, not because everyone liked it, some thought it too sweet or too dry, but because it sparkled with prestige. A toast with champagne wasn't just celebratory, it was a subtle reminder that the host could afford imported bubbles when most people were drinking beer. Port and sherry, often imported from Portugal and Spain, rounded out the evening, offering yet another opportunity to flaunt global connections. Exotic imports didn't stop at the table. Presentation often emphasized their foreign origins. Fruits were piled in ornate bowls, as though they had just arrived straight from the tropics, even though they had probably been sweating in storage for weeks. Spices were sometimes referenced in menu cards, written in French to make them sound even more impressive. A mango wasn't just a mango, it was manguio sirop, transformed into haute cuisine by the addition of French words and lots of sugar. Of course, all this extravagance came at a cost. Imported foods were expensive, especially if they were out of season. A host who served fresh grapes in winter was making a financial statement as much as a culinary one. The more impractical the ingredient, the greater the prestige. Guests were meant to marvel, not just at the flavour, but at the sheer improbability of eating tropical fruit in a London townhouse lit by gas lamps. This obsession also created a curious tension between tradition and novelty. Roast beef and Yorkshire pudding might anchor the dinner, but a side dish of curried chicken or a dessert flavoured with vanilla pods whispered of cosmopolitan sophistication. The trick was balance. Too many foreign imports and you risked looking like a tryhard. Too few, and you seemed provincial. The Edwardian host had to orchestrate a menu that walked the fine line between comfort and spectacle. For many guests, exotic foods were double-edged swords. They impressed, yes, but they also confused. Imagine being served a fruit you'd never seen before, expected to eat it gracefully under the gaze of 30 aristocrats. Do you peel it? Do you bite it? Do you poke it with one of the mysterious forks scattered across the table? One wrong move and you weren't just uncouth, you were comedic fodder for gossip columns. And while we might imagine Edwardians joyfully embracing these imports, the reality was often more complicated. Not everyone actually liked mangoes, pineapples, or heavily spiced dishes. Some found them overwhelming, even strange. But liking the food wasn't the point. The point was to eat it, smile, and acknowledge the host's magnificence. Appetite was secondary to status. In the end, exotic imports were less about taste buds and more about bragging rights. They turned the Edwardian table into a miniature empire, a microcosm of global conquest and trade. Every pineapple, every spice, every imported bottle of wine was another jewel in the crown of dinner party obsession. So the next time you see pineapples stacked casually in a supermarket, remember, once upon a time, a single pineapple could make or break your social standing. The Edwardians weren't eating fruit, they were eating prestige. If the food at an Edwardian dinner party was the orchestra, then the wine was the conductor, guiding the pace, setting the tone, and occasionally ensuring that everyone went wildly off-key by midnight. Edwardians didn't just serve wine, they built a whole ritual around it, a flowing symphony of bottles that punctuated each course. Edwardians didn't count glasses of wine, they counted regrets in the morning. Wine service began with a plan, a serious plan. Hosts didn't just toss bottles on the table and let guests pick. No, the wine list was choreographed like a ballet. The butler and host carefully matched specific vintages to specific courses, sherry or Madeira to open, white wines with fish, robust reds with meat, champagne at the dramatic midpoint, and fortified wines like port to close. If food was the centerpiece of Edwardian dining, then wine was the glue that kept conversation lubricated and the courses flowing, and flow it did. Unlike today, when wine service might mean a single bottle shared throughout dinner, Edwardian guests faced a veritable Niagara Falls of alcohol. A 10-course dinner could feature 6 or more different wines, each poured with precision into the correct glass. Guests weren't expected to drain every glass, though many valiantly tried. Instead, the array of half-filled goblets glittered beside each plate like a crystal timeline of the evening's progression, from the pale whites of the fish course to the dark ruby port of the finale. Of course, etiquette ruled the ritual. Guests never poured their own wine, that was the butler's sacred task. Servants glided from chair to chair, filling glasses to exactly the right level, never brimming, never stingy, and always from the correct side. Wine was poured silently, gracefully, and ideally without spilling a single drop on the immaculate tablecloth. A clumsy pour wasn't just sloppy, it was a social misdemeanor. Champagne was the star of the Edwardian table. Its bubbles symbolized celebration, modernity and sophistication. No dinner party worth its salt or sugar skipped champagne. It was often served mid-meal, a refreshing reset between the heavy meat courses and the onslaught of desserts. The sound of popping corks wasn't just festive, it was reassuring, the sign that the host had both style and money to burn. Guests lifted their crystal flutes, clinked delicately, never too hard lest you shatter a glass, and toasted with smiles that often masked creeping indigestion. But the true finale of Edwardian wine culture was port. After the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, the men remained at the table, where port was passed ceremoniously around. Tradition dictated that the bottle be placed to the left of the host and passed clockwise, never lingering too long with one man. A guest who held the port hostage risked glares or jokes. "Pass the port, sir, lest we die of thirst before the next toast." Port was more than a drink. It was the glue of masculine bonding, washed down with cigars and endless talk of politics, hunting or business. Of course, not everyone actually liked the wines on offer. Sweet sherries, heavy clarets and syrupy Madeiras weren't universally beloved, but enjoyment wasn't the point. Drinking them signalled refinement, participation, and let's be blunt, endurance. You might dislike that German Riesling, but you'd sip it anyway because refusing would suggest you lacked sophistication. A palate wasn't required. Compliance was. The health consequences of such excess were predictably grim. Edwardian doctors frequently warned of port stomach, a charming euphemism for indigestion, gout, and worse. Overindulgence was common, especially since guests felt obliged to at least taste every glass presented. Imagine finishing a marathon, only to discover that dessert was another mile. That was Edwardian wine culture. A guest might leave the table flushed, merry, and on the verge of writing terrible poetry, or simply collapse into a carriage and regret everything by dawn. For the servants, wine service was another layer of stress. Cellars had to be stocked and bottles decanted ahead of time, sometimes hours in advance to let the flavours breathe. Butlers memorised vintages like schoolchildren cramming for exams. A single mix-up, say, serving a red with the fish course, could stain a household's reputation more than the worst gossip. Guests might forgive a cold soup, but the wrong wine? Unthinkable. There was also the sheer cost. Fine French wines, ports from Portugal, sherries from Spain. These weren't cheap, especially when served in vast quantities, but expense was part of the spectacle. A host who served humble beer with dinner would be laughed out of society. Wine wasn't optional, it was mandatory, a liquid emblem of refinement. The more bottles opened, the higher the social standing. The morning headaches were simply collateral damage. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Edwardian wine culture was its symbolism. To pour, sip and toast was to participate in the rituals of empire, wealth and hierarchy. The wines themselves were global, their presence reminding everyone that Britain had access to the world's vineyards. To drink was to taste not only grapes but also prestige. So picture the Edwardian table, half a dozen glasses glittering in front of you, each filled in sequence, each demanding at least a polite sip. You start with enthusiasm, glide through champagne, endure the reds, and stagger into port. Conversation flows, laughter rises, the chandeliers sparkle, and beneath it all you can hear the faint groan of your liver plotting revenge. Because in Edwardian Britain, wine wasn't just a drink, it was the social fuel of the evening, the liquid proof of status, and the reason why so many guests woke up the next morning swearing they would never ever eat or drink that much again, until the next invitation arrived. If Edwardian men were expected to eat, drink and pontificate like overfed walruses, Edwardian women had a far trickier role to play. Their presence at the dinner table wasn't about appetite, it was about appearance. Women weren't supposed to eat too much, just starve elegantly under a chandelier. The Edwardian dinner party was less about a woman's plate and more about her poise. First, there were the rules of conduct. A woman's job at the table was to look graceful, speak politely, and above all, avoid drawing negative attention. She was expected to contribute to conversation but never dominate it. Her laugh had to be delicate, her smile charming, and her appetite discreet. To wolf down meat like her male counterparts would have been scandalous. A polite nibble of fish, a careful bite of pheasant, and perhaps a forkful of pudding later on, that was considered quite enough. Hunger pangs were no excuse for gluttony. Corsets didn't help matters. Many Edwardian gowns forced women into shapes that looked stunning under candlelight, but left little room for breathing, let alone eating. Imagine trying to enjoy roast duck while your lungs were laced tighter than a ship's rigging. Many women learned the art of eating delicately, which really meant pushing food around the plate and hoping no one noticed how little they consumed. Dinner wasn't nourishment, it was a performance of restraint. There was also the matter of conversation. Women were expected to shine in social exchanges without overshadowing the men. Acceptable topics included art, literature, fashion and travel. Unacceptable topics included politics, business, or anything that might suggest a woman had serious opinions. Too quiet, and she risked being labelled dull. Too opinionated, and she risked being labelled dangerous. The balance was delicate, and women had to walk that conversational tightrope in heels and gloves. Even the simple act of eating was filled with pitfalls. Women had to navigate multiple forks, knives and glasses while keeping movements dainty and controlled. Dropping a fork could earn an unfortunate reputation. Spilling sauce on a silk gown was near catastrophic. And don't forget the gloves. Removing them at the proper time before eating but after greeting was a social test in itself. One could almost forgive a woman for staring at her plate with more fear than anticipation. Beyond etiquette, women's placement at the table carried symbolic weight. Seating charts often placed women between men, ensuring conversation flowed evenly, and no man was left awkwardly addressing only another man during the meal. The presence of women was meant to soften the room, adding beauty and elegance to an otherwise testosterone-heavy banquet. Women were the decoration as much as the food or the flowers. Their gowns, jewels and coiffed hairstyles glittered in the candlelight, enhancing the spectacle of the evening. And yet, despite their constrained roles, Edwardian women wielded subtle power. A woman's approval or disapproval could make or break a hostess's reputation. A gracious remark about the soup, delivered with just the right amount of sincerity, was as valuable as a glowing review in the society pages. Likewise, an arched eyebrow at an undercooked fish course could set tongues wagging the next day. Women may have been bound by etiquette, but they were also arbiters of taste. There was also the unspoken courtship element. Dinner parties were prime opportunities for eligible women to be seen and admired. A witty remark, a graceful smile, or a well-timed compliment could catch the attention of a wealthy bachelor or his mother, which was often more important. For many young women, dinner parties weren't just meals, they were auditions for a future role as wife, hostess and social partner. In a world where marriage was often a career, The table was a stage on which fortunes were made, but it wasn't all opportunity. Dinner parties also exposed women to scrutiny and criticism. Every detail, her gown, her jewellery, her hairstyle, her manners, was under inspection. A gown slightly out of fashion, whispers; a laugh too loud, scandal; a hearty appetite, catastrophe. For men, mistakes at dinner might be laughed off after a brandy. For women, they lingered like stains on silk. Interestingly, while women's role at the table was constrained, their influence increased once dinner ended. After the heavy courses and endless wine, women traditionally withdrew to the drawing room, leaving the men to their port and cigars. This ritual separation reinforced gender roles, but also gave women space to control their own sphere. In the drawing room, conversation often turned to gossip, art, or philanthropy, topics where women's opinions could shine more freely. For that brief interlude, they weren't decorative accessories, but the main participants. Still, the dinner table itself remained a stage of restraint. Women weren't there to eat heartily, drink deeply, or dominate conversation. They were there to embody elegance, to keep conversation civil, and to make the evening sparkle with beauty. In many ways, they were judged not by what they said or ate, but by how well they embodied the Edwardian ideal of refinement. So picture the scene: a long table groaning under the weight of food, men carving into venison like warriors, and women delicately nibbling at salad leaves, smiling serenely while secretly wishing for a sandwich. The chandeliers glitter, the gowns shimmer, and everyone pretends this elaborate dance is perfectly natural. Because in Edwardian Britain, women weren't really supposed to eat dinner. They were supposed to be dinner ornaments, conversation pieces and trophies of elegance, all seated under the glow of 100 candles. When the last spoon of pudding was scraped, the final toast was made, and the ladies had withdrawn gracefully to the drawing room. The Edwardian dinner party split into two worlds. For the women, it was lace, gossip, and tea. For the men, it was a retreat into a smoke-filled sanctuary of brandy and bravado. Here, freed from the delicate performance of table manners and small talk, Edwardian men could finally do what they did best: overindulge, pontificate, and pretend they weren't about to fall asleep in their armchairs. Where men discussed politics while secretly trying not to pass out from overeating, the men's retreat typically took place in a separate room, often a library, study, or smoking room, furnished with dark woods, heavy leather chairs, and enough cigar smoke to choke a cavalry regiment. The atmosphere was markedly different from the dining room. Gone were the glittering chandeliers, the towering flower arrangements, and the constant hovering of servants with soup spoons and fish knives. Instead, this was a world of dim light, deep armchairs, and the reassuring clink of brandy glasses. It was, in many ways, a boys' club with better upholstery. First came the cigars. Boxes were passed around and men selected with the seriousness of priests choosing communion wafers. Lighting them was practically ceremonial. A servant or the host himself might offer a flame, and the first puff signalled entry into this masculine sphere. Soon the room filled with thick clouds of smoke, giving it the ambience of a volcanic eruption disguised as a social gathering. For many men, the cigar was more than a luxury, it was a badge of identity. Smoking was a sign of masculinity, wealth, and membership in the club of gentlemen who could afford to burn money in leaf form. Then came the brandy, poured generously into large balloon glasses. The amber liquid gleamed in the lamplight. Unlike the wines at dinner, which had to be sipped politely and in sequence, brandy was meant to be savoured slowly, swirled in the glass while men pontificated about weighty matters. Or at least that was the idea. In practice, many guests swallowed their brandy like medicine, hoping it would calm their overstuffed stomachs. If the food hadn't already sent your digestive system into panic, the brandy certainly finished the job. The conversations in these smoking rooms were a study in Edwardian masculinity. Politics, business, imperial affairs, horse racing and hunting dominated the talk. This was not the place for delicate observations about the latest fashion in Paris. Here, men declaimed with authority, even if their knowledge of the subject was about as sturdy as their waistcoats after 10 courses of beef and pheasant. Seriousness was part of the performance. A man who didn't contribute to discussion risked looking dull. A man who contributed too much risked looking pompous. The balance, as ever in Edwardian society, was delicate, but beneath the smoke and the bravado, the men's retreat served another function. It was an escape. After hours of stiff-backed posture at the dinner table, of carefully measured etiquette and endless courses, men could finally slump into armchairs, loosen waistcoats, and sigh without shame. They could rub their stomachs, unbutton collars, and allow the reality of overeating to settle in. The retreat was less about politics and more about survival. For the servants, the men's retreat was yet another logistical nightmare. Decanters of brandy had to be kept full, cigars provided, ashtrays discreetly emptied. A steady stream of matches, soda water and coffee circulated through the haze. The butler presided here too, ensuring the flow of drink never faltered. Even in this supposedly relaxed sphere, the machinery of service kept the illusion running. What's striking is the ritual exclusion of women. The retreat was meant to be a masculine preserve, a space where men could say things they would never dare utter at the dinner table. Some of it was serious, debates about the Boer War or tariffs, but much of it was gossip, jokes, or even dozing in a chair while pretending to listen. The idea that women might intrude was unthinkable. The smoking room was as sacred to men as the drawing room was to women. Each gender had its realm, and crossing the boundary would have been scandalous. Of course, the illusion of masculine vigour often clashed with physical reality. After 10 courses and several glasses of wine, many men found their eyelids drooping. More than one guest surely nodded off mid-discussion, his cigar drooping dangerously close to his lapel. Others staggered home unsteadily, blaming the uneven cobblestones rather than the 7 glasses of claret and 2 brandies. But such lapses were part of the charm. To overeat and oversmoke was practically expected, proof that one had participated fully in the ritual of excess. The men's retreat was, ultimately, less about the content of conversation than about the ritual itself. The smoke, the brandy, the exclusivity, it all reinforced bonds of class, gender, and privilege. To sit in that room was to belong, to be acknowledged as part of the circle of men who ruled the empire by day and digested it by night. So when you picture the Edwardian dinner party, don't just see the glittering dining room or the graceful ladies sipping tea. Imagine a dark, smoky room full of stuffed men trying to look authoritative while battling the urge to nap. The empire may have been run on politics, trade and industry, but it was also run on cigars, brandy, and a collective agreement to ignore how uncomfortable everyone really was. Because in Edwardian Britain, the men's retreat wasn't just an after-dinner ritual. It was a sanctuary of smoke, swagger, and survival. When the men finally dragged themselves from their smoky sanctum of cigars and brandy, and the women put down their cups of tea and artful gossip, the dinner party wasn't finished, not by a long shot. In Edwardian Britain, the true climax of the evening often came not at the dining table, but in the drawing room, where parlour games and entertainment took centre stage. After all, nothing says classy like charades in a corset. These after-dinner activities weren't just frivolous amusements. They were carefully chosen rituals meant to keep conversation flowing, bridge the awkward gap between genders, and prove that your household had both refinement and a sense of fun. Dinner filled the stomach, but parlour games filled the silence. Charades was perhaps the most popular choice. Guests acted out words or phrases in mime while others guessed, all while trying not to burst their seams in layers of silk or wool. A lady might totter around pretending to be an elephant, feathers swaying, while a dignified gentleman flapped his arms to represent swan. The absurdity was half the charm. Everyone knew it was ridiculous, but that was the point. Laughter softened the stiffness of formality. The risk, of course, was that some guests took themselves too seriously, turning charades into an endurance test of exaggerated dignity. Nothing ruins a round of Romeo and Juliet like Lord Wetherington refusing to die gracefully on the carpet. Other games tested wit rather than physical comedy. Consequences, a paper-folding game, had guests take turns writing parts of a sentence without seeing the previous contributions. The results were often nonsensical. Lady Pembroke met a cabbage in Hyde Park, said to him, "I adore your monocle," and the consequence was a scandal in Wales. These games allowed everyone to laugh without the danger of revealing too much about themselves. After all, the consequences stayed safely on paper. For those who wanted something less silly, there were word games and riddles. Guests competed to outwit each other with clever answers, displaying intelligence without straying into controversial territory. The key was balance. Be witty enough to impress, but not so witty that you embarrassed others. This was social fencing with blunt swords. And then there was music. Many Edwardian drawing rooms boasted a piano, and after dinner, a guest might be invited or voluntold to perform. Ladies who could play Chopin or sing a ballad earned admiring glances, or at least polite applause. Hiring professional entertainers was also common. A violinist, a singer, or even a small string quartet might be brought in to elevate the evening. Of course, reactions varied. Some guests genuinely enjoyed the performances, others nodded along, desperately trying not to fall asleep as the strains of Schubert mingled with the lingering effects of port. Not all entertainment was genteel. Some households enjoyed parlor tricks, fortune-telling, palm reading, or even amateur seance. Spiritualism was fashionable in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, and a dinner party might end with dimmed lights, guests holding hands around a table, and someone dramatically announcing they felt a presence. Whether anyone actually believed or just enjoyed the theatricality didn't matter. It was all part of the show. These games and performances weren't just about amusement, they were social tools. A witty remark during charades could make you seem charming. A graceful piano performance could raise your stock in the marriage market. Even laughing at the right moment marked you as a good guest. Entertainment after dinner wasn't just fun, it was networking with jokes. Of course, there were risks. Games could go wrong. Guests might get too competitive, turning a round of cards into a minor scandal. A lady fainting during an enthusiastic game of musical chairs would be remembered long after the menu was forgotten. And sometimes the entertainment dragged, forcing guests to smile through endless verses of a sentimental ballad sung slightly off-key. Hosts had to gauge the mood carefully. Too silly, and you risked losing dignity. Too serious, and the evening fell flat. One important element of these amusements was the mixing of genders. After the strict separations of dinner and the men's retreat, games provided a way to bring men and women back together in a socially acceptable manner. A game of charades might pair a young bachelor with a debutante, offering opportunities for flirtation under the guise of play. Entertainment smoothed the way for connections, romantic, political, or financial. The drawing room was less a playground and more a marketplace of charm. For the servants, this phase of the evening was both a relief and a burden. The pressure of the meal was over, but now they had to ferry in tea, coffee, and perhaps late-night snacks. They also had to endure the sounds of laughter, applause, and the occasional shriek of someone acting out octopus while balancing on one foot. Behind the scenes they rolled their eyes, but they also knew their employers' reputations depended on keeping the amusement alive. By the end of the evening, when the candles burned low and the laughter grew softer, guests prepared to depart with the memory of not just the dinner, but the games, music, and frivolity that followed. A good round of charades could be the talk of the week. A disastrous song performance could become the season's favourite anecdote. Entertainment wasn't an afterthought. It was the final seasoning of the Edwardian dinner party, the flourish that turned overeating into an experience worth remembering. So imagine it, gowns rustling, cigars lingering on the air, guests roaring with laughter as a lady in satin pretends to be a giraffe, while a viscount yells Cinderella into the haze. That, more than the roast beef or the pudding, was the heart of Edwardian entertainment. Dinner filled the body, parlour games filled the soul, and occasionally embarrassed it beyond repair. If the parlour games of Edwardian after-dinner entertainment brought out silliness, then music and performances were meant to restore dignity, or at least the illusion of it. For the Edwardians, no evening of excess was truly complete without a musical interlude, a bit of theatrical flair, or a hired professional reminding everyone that culture was as essential as calories. Dinner guests clapped politely, even if the music sounded like a cat auditioning for opera. The centerpiece of many drawing rooms was the piano, a gleaming upright, or in wealthier households, a full grand piano often dominated the room, positioned strategically to impress visitors. After dinner, someone, usually a young lady of the house or a musically inclined guest, would be invited to play. Invitations were rarely refusals. Declining to perform could be interpreted as a slight, while performing badly was simply endured with clenched smiles. A guest might strike up a nocturne, play a lively waltz, or stumble through the latest popular tune while everyone pretended not to notice the missed notes. For those blessed or cursed with a good singing voice, after-dinner performances often included songs. Parlour ballads were the staple, sentimental tunes about love, longing, or pastoral bliss. Sometimes Italian arias made their way into the repertoire, though not always with the vocal power required to do them justice. It was common to see a drawing room full of stiff-backed Edwardians clapping politely, while someone bellowed "O Sole Mio" at a volume better suited for an outdoor market. No matter, The performance wasn't about musical perfection, it was about proving the household had culture. Of course, not every family relied on the talents of their guests. Many Edwardian hosts hired professional musicians. A string quartet might be stationed discreetly in the corner, bowing their way through Mozart and Haydn, while the guests murmured approval. A singer, harpist, or violinist could be brought in for a single evening, their wages tucked discreetly into an envelope at the end of the night. For wealthier hosts, hiring talent wasn't just about entertainment, it was about prestige. A famous soprano, even performing one aria, could elevate a dinner from impressive to legendary. Guests might not remember the soup, but they would remember hearing a Covent Garden soloist warble in a private home. Sometimes the performances were theatrical. Amateur dramatics flourished in Edwardian society, and dinner parties occasionally ended with short recitations or even staged scenes. A guest might declaim a Shakespearean sonnet, or a small troupe might perform a comedy sketch. These performances were not always brilliant. Imagine someone attempting Hamlet after 5 glasses of claret, but they were memorable. The line between artistry and absurdity was very thin indeed. Children of the household were often recruited for these performances, much to their dismay. Young daughters might be nudged to the piano to play a piece they had only half mastered, while sons recited poetry with all the enthusiasm of someone facing execution. Guests smiled indulgently, but everyone knew these performances weren't about talent. They were about showing off the family's investments in tutors and culture. It was less concert and more progress report. The etiquette surrounding music was as important as the music itself. Guests were expected to listen attentively, no matter how dire the performance. Whispering or yawning during a sonata was the height of rudeness. Applause had to be enthusiastic but not excessive. Too little, and you seemed cold. Too much, and you risked insincerity. The perfect Edwardian clap was restrained, with just enough vigour to say, "That was delightful, but not so much as to imply, we're desperate for you to stop." Not all guests enjoyed these interludes. Some found them tedious interruptions to gossip or flirtation. Others endured them as a necessary display of culture before returning to more entertaining pursuits. But for hosts, the presence of music was non-negotiable. A dinner without a performance risked being labelled vulgar. No matter how fine the food had been, culture had to be on the menu, even if it was slightly out of tune. Professional musicians sometimes faced a peculiar predicament: invisibility. Guests applauded politely, but rarely engaged with the performers as people. They were treated almost like furniture, elegant, functional, and promptly forgotten once they stopped playing. Yet these hired performers were vital to the atmosphere, filling rooms with sound that masked awkward silences and lent grandeur to otherwise ordinary evenings. Interestingly, music also provided opportunities for subtle manoeuvring. A particularly accomplished guest might win admiration and elevate their social standing by playing a difficult piece flawlessly. A young woman might impress a suitor or his watchful mother by displaying both musical talent and modesty. Even a clumsy performance could serve a purpose if it made the right people laugh. The drawing room stage was a social laboratory where notes and lyrics carried as much weight as conversation, and while most performances were entirely respectable, occasionally things went gloriously wrong. A piano string snapping mid-song, a singer forgetting lyrics, or a violin squeaking like a strangled goose could turn an evening into legend. Guests would recount such mishaps for weeks, laughing at the memory while diplomatically avoiding mention of who was responsible. For all their emphasis on elegance, Edwardians loved a good story, and nothing made a better story than a musical disaster. By the end of the evening, whether it was Chopin played flawlessly or God Save the King mangled on the piano, music had done its work. It had filled the silence, proved the host's cultural credentials, and given guests something to clap about before heading home. So imagine the scene: gowns glimmering, brandy fumes still lingering, a young lady nervously plinking out a waltz while an elderly earl nods off in his chair. The applause rises, polite and restrained, as everyone agrees the performance was lovely. And even if it wasn't, well, no one dared say so, because in Edwardian Britain, culture was mandatory, even if it came wrapped in the sound of a cat auditioning for opera. If Edwardian dinner parties were performances, then conversation was the script and everyone knew their lines. The rules of table talk weren't just suggestions, they were commandments. What you said, how you said it, and even what you didn't say, could define your place in society. The food may have filled your plate, but the talk filled the silence. and silence was deadly. Safe topics included hunting and art, unsafe topics, anything remotely interesting. The most sacred rule was avoid controversy. Politics, religion, money and scandal were strictly off limits. You might think those are the most interesting subjects at a dinner table, but Edwardians believed they were dangerous traps. A casual remark about the Prime Minister could spiral into an argument, and nothing ruined a soufflé faster than two earls shouting about tariffs. Religion was even more taboo. One ill-timed opinion about Methodists could turn the whole room into a powder keg. Money was vulgar to mention, even though everyone was silently calculating everyone else's income based on the flower arrangements. And scandal, that was saved for whispered gossip after dinner, never during. So what was allowed? A short list of safe conversational fodder. The weather, an eternal classic since no one could be offended by rain. Travel, especially exotic places that proved your wealth without sounding like bragging. Art and literature, but only the respectable kind. No one wanted to hear about shocking modernists. On-racked hunting and country sports. Fox hunting was practically a conversational default setting. On-rack music, theatre or opera, but nothing too avant-garde. In short, you could talk about anything that was both safe and boring. The trick was to make it sound lively, while never actually straying into lively territory. Dinner conversation was a peculiar performance of enthusiasm for topics everyone secretly found dull. Seating arrangements shaped conversation too. A guest typically spoke to the person seated on their left for one course, then to the person on their right for the next. This rotation ensured that no one was ignored for the entire evening, but also meant you had to repeat your charming anecdotes with fresh energy for the new audience. Imagine telling the same story about your trip to Paris twice in a row, once to a viscount and then to a baroness, both of whom are pretending they haven't already heard it from 3 other guests that week. For women, conversation was especially delicate. They were expected to sparkle, to flatter, and to guide discussions without venturing into controversial waters. A witty remark about a painting or a gracious comment on the flowers might win admiration, but anything too intellectual risked raising eyebrows. Cleverness was allowed, but only in moderation. Too much, and you were accused of being bookish, the Edwardian equivalent of a social death sentence. Men had more freedom but were also constrained by etiquette. They could expound on hunting, horses, or even agriculture, but not on politics unless they were in the smoking room later, fortified by port. At the table, they were expected to keep things light and agreeable, which for some men was as difficult as resisting a 4th slice of roast beef. Awkward pauses were the true enemy. A lull in conversation suggested boredom, and boredom suggested failure of the host, the guest, or both. To avoid silence, guests rehearsed little conversational tidbits ready to deploy when needed. These were the Edwardian equivalent of small talk starters. Have you seen the new exhibition at the Royal Academy? Or I hear the roses in Hyde Park are quite exceptional this season. Today we might laugh at such banality, but in a world where missteps carried social consequences, safe dullness was infinitely preferable to risky originality. Of course, not everyone excelled at table talk. Some guests were notorious bores, droning on about their stamp collections or their latest trip to Bath in excruciating detail. Hosts tried to minimize damage by seating these individuals next to patient listeners, or people whose social standing was so low that they couldn't complain. The true conversational masters, meanwhile, became prized guests, invited everywhere for their ability to keep the table lively without ever saying anything truly dangerous. There were subtle power plays too. Complimenting the host or hostess was obligatory, but how you did it mattered. Too effusive, and you looked insincere. Too restrained, and you seemed ungrateful. The perfect compliment was like seasoning, enough to add flavour, not so much that it overpowered the dish. Likewise, dropping hints about your own travels, acquaintances, or cultural tastes had to be done carefully. Bragging was vulgar, but a sly remark. When I was in Rome last spring could elevate your standing without crossing the line. And then there were the conversational hazards. Mishearing someone and replying inappropriately could lead to awkward moments. Accidentally steering into politics or money could freeze a table faster than spilled ice water. And laughter, always polite, never raucous, had to be timed carefully. Laugh too loudly, and you looked common. Fail to laugh at all, and you looked humourless. In the end, table talk was less about what was said, and more about how it was said. The words were secondary. The delivery was everything. tone, posture, timing, and restraint turned small talk into an art form. The Edwardians weren't trying to solve problems or share truths. They were weaving a net of civility, where everyone was safe, entertained, and slightly bored together. So picture yourself at the Edwardian table, chandeliers blazing, forks glittering, and your seatmate leaning in to ask, "Have you read the latest Trollope novel?" You smile, nod, and deliver a carefully rehearsed quip. Across the table, someone else is doing the same. Conversation ripples around the room, safe, controlled, and devoid of anything that might spark actual excitement. It was elegance by way of verbal beige, calculated dullness dressed in silk and silver, because in Edwardian Britain, dinner conversation wasn't about what mattered, it was about what didn't. By the time the final course was cleared and the servants whisked away the last crumbs of pudding, the real feast was just beginning, not the food but the gossip. Edwardian dinner parties may have dazzled with chandeliers, roast pheasants, and too many forks, but the real reason many attended was the chatter that followed. You came for the roast beef, but stayed for the roasting of absent neighbours. Gossip was the unofficial dessert of Edwardian society. It was sweet, addictive, and often far more memorable than the actual meal. Guests leaned closer, lowered their voices, and shared the tidbits they had been hoarding for precisely this moment. Who was bankrupt but still pretending otherwise? Which heiress was being courted by 3 suitors at once? Which politician was rumoured to have fainted during fox hunting? None of this appeared on the menu, but everyone devoured it, greedily. The genius of Edwardian gossip was its subtlety. No one blurted out scandal directly, that was far too crass. Instead, remarks were dropped casually, like crumbs, and others were expected to pick them up. A lady might murmur, "I hear Lord Ellington has been spending rather a lot of time in Paris," and let the ellipsis do the heavy lifting. Everyone knew what that meant, and within minutes, Lord Ellington's supposed Parisian adventures were being embroidered into full-blown escapades involving actresses, champagne, and questionable morals. This whispering culture thrived because Edwardian society was obsessed with appearances. Dinner parties were showcases of wealth and refinement, but beneath the surface, everyone was desperate to know who was faltering. Gossip was a form of social currency, traded as freely as wine. Being the first to share a juicy detail elevated your status. Being the last to hear it risked humiliation. If the soup was cold, you could forgive the hostess. If you had nothing new to contribute to the rumour mill, you were socially useless. And gossip didn't just stay at the table. What began as a murmured remark in one drawing room could spiral across London in days. Newspapers played their part, publishing society columns that danced around scandal with tantalising vagueness. A vague reference to a well-known nobleman was enough to set tongues wagging at the next dinner. Everyone loved a mystery, especially when they thought they knew the answer. For women, gossip was both weapon and shield. In a world where their public voices were restricted, gossip offered influence. A sharp-tongued remark about someone's finances or fashion could ripple outward, shaping reputations. A well-placed compliment could build alliances. Drawing-room whispers were the power politics of Edwardian women, conducted under the cover of silk gowns and polite laughter. Men too indulged, though they liked to pretend their talk was weightier. A discussion about a business deal might slide effortlessly into speculation about who was cheating at cards. A hunting anecdote could end with a sly remark about who was staggering drunk in the stables. For all their cigars and brandy bravado, men were just as eager to pick at the reputations of their peers as women were. They simply cloaked it in thicker smoke. Of course, gossip was risky. Repeat something untrue, and you might find yourself the subject of the next round of whispers. Guests had to tread carefully, sharing just enough to seem informed without revealing themselves as malicious. The line between wit and cruelty was thin, and crossing it could backfire. Still, the temptation was irresistible. Better to risk being gossiped about than to sit in silence like a piece of ornamental furniture. Gossip wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was affectionate, even entertaining. Tales of eccentric relatives, absurd fashion choices, or laughable faux pas circulated for amusement as much as for judgment. Did you see Lady Pembroke's hat? I swear it could shelter an entire parish. Harmless exaggerations kept conversation lively, and gave everyone the chance to chuckle at someone else's expense without drawing too much blood. But make no mistake, serious gossip carried power. Rumours about fortunes lost, marriages failing, or scandals brewing could influence who was invited to the next dinner, who was courted for marriage, or who quietly slipped down the social ladder. A single whispered remark could do more damage than a dozen official pronouncements. Gossip was the invisible glue of Edwardian society, sticky and impossible to avoid. Even the servants were part of this ecosystem, though forbidden to speak openly. They absorbed every overheard remark and retold it below stairs. By the end of the week, the scullery maid might know more about aristocratic affairs than the guests themselves. Gossip trickled downward and then back up, circulating through the city like smoke from the dinner room candles. By the time guests gathered their cloaks and prepared to depart, gossip had already been digested. The food would fade from memory, the music might blur, but the whispered stories, those lingered. As carriages rattled away, guests leaned to their companions and began the real post-dinner ritual. Did you hear what she said about Lady Pembroke's son? The cycle continued, nourishing the social bloodstream until the next dinner provided more fuel. So while the Edwardians prided themselves on fine dining, etiquette and elegance, the truth is that the real dessert wasn't pudding. It was the whispered thrill of scandal, served with a side of raised eyebrows. For in Edwardian Britain, gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was the true delicacy of the evening, the one course no one ever refused. For all their meticulous planning, strict etiquette, and armies of servants, Edwardian dinner parties were never immune to disaster. In fact, the more elaborate the evening, the greater the chance that something would go gloriously wrong. And when it did, no amount of lace tablecloths or polished silver could cover it up. Nothing ruins a soufflé like someone fainting into it. Scandals at the table came in many forms, ranging from the mildly embarrassing to the career-ending. The most common culprit? Food mishaps. With so many courses, sauces and delicate constructions, disaster was practically inevitable. A soufflé could collapse at the exact moment it was carried into the room, robbing the hostess of her culinary triumph. A guest might discover a fishbone lodged firmly in their throat, prompting a coughing fit that drowned out the string quartet. Servants occasionally stumbled, sending trays of wine cascading down the back of an unsuspecting dowager's gown. Each accident became instant legend, recounted gleefully in drawing rooms for weeks. Then there were the guests themselves. Overindulgence was practically built into Edwardian dining, and with it came predictable consequences. A man who had attacked the venison too vigorously might find his waistcoat straining ominously, or worse, might doze off mid-conversation, snoring loudly while everyone else pretended not to notice. Fainting was a particular hazard for women in tightly laced corsets. One too many courses, combined with candle-lit heat and a lack of oxygen, could send even the most elegant lady tumbling sideways into the asparagus. A discreet swoon might be forgiven. A full collapse into the dessert was harder to overlook. Spilled drinks were another social landmine. With so many glasses crowding each place setting, accidents were almost inevitable. A misplaced elbow could send claret spreading across the immaculate tablecloth like a crimson Rorschach test. Champagne might erupt unexpectedly, dousing nearby diners in sticky bubbles. The host would smile, the servants would scramble, and the victim would sit in mortified silence, convinced their social reputation had dissolved in the puddle of port soaking through their satin sleeves. Of course, the worst scandals weren't physical, they were verbal. Despite the ironclad rules of table talk, guests occasionally slipped. A careless remark about politics, a two-pointed joke about someone's finances, or a veiled reference to gossip better left unspoken, could freeze the entire room. Imagine 30 people suddenly pretending to be fascinated by the centerpiece while Lady So-and-so and Lord What's-His-Name exchanged daggers with their eyes. Recovering from such a blunder required immense charm or another glass of champagne. And then there were the fashion emergencies. With women swathed in silks and men trussed up in starched collars, wardrobe malfunctions were bound to happen. A tiara might slip dramatically, a corset might creak ominously, or a sleeve might trail into the soup. Guests were expected to ignore such mishaps politely, though that didn't stop them from mentioning it gleefully later. After all, nothing enlivened conversation quite like the memory of a viscountess fishing gravy off her elbow. Some scandals escalated beyond mere mishaps. Rivalries occasionally boiled over. Two men might glare at each other across the roast beef, their conversation edged with veiled insults until the entire table sensed a duel was brewing. Ladies might exchange cutting remarks disguised as compliments, their smiles tight enough to shatter glass. While outright shouting matches were rare, the possibility always lurked beneath the surface, like a shark circling beneath candlelit waters. Servants, too, could unwittingly cause scandal. A tray dropped, a wrong dish served, or heaven forbid, wine poured into the wrong glass could unleash a storm of disapproval. Worse still, a servant overhearing gossip and accidentally reacting with a smirk could destroy the fragile illusion of invisibility. The Edwardian obsession with seamless service meant that even the smallest slip became fodder for judgment. And let's not forget the occasional uninvited guest. Sometimes animals wandered in, cats slipping under tables, dogs making off with scraps, or worse, drunken acquaintances arriving late and uninvited, demanding to be seated. The hosts, mortified, had to juggle diplomacy while silently wishing the floor would open up and swallow their reputations whole. The fascinating thing about Edwardian scandals is that they rarely ended at the dinner party. One fainting fit, one ill-timed remark, or one splattered dress could circulate in society for months. Newspapers rarely printed such things outright, but the gossip machine ensured that everyone in London knew who had disgraced themselves by the following week. A single blunder could see your invitations dry up, your name whispered with pity or amusement, and your social climb abruptly halted. Yet, paradoxically, scandal also added spice. A dinner without mishap might be remembered as pleasant but dull. A dinner where Lord Pembroke snored into his soup or Lady Ashcroft toppled a wine-glass over the bishop was infinitely more entertaining. Guests craved stories as much as they craved pheasant, and a little disaster provided exactly that. So picture it, the table glittering with crystal, the guests leaning in for polite conversation, when suddenly a servant trips, the soup spills, and Lady Carrington slides dramatically under the table in a faint. Gasps ripple through the room, fans flutter, and someone whispers, "Well, at least the pudding survived." In that moment, the Edwardian dinner party transforms from performance into comedy, and everyone leaves with a tale to tell. Because for all their obsession with control, elegance and etiquette, the Edwardians knew one truth all too well. Nothing livens up a dining room faster than a scandal. For all their elegance, chandeliers and carefully choreographed courses, Edwardian dinners came with a hidden cost, the bill paid by the human body. 10 courses of meat, sauces, pastries and rivers of wine weren't just a social marathon, they were a medical hazard. Every meal came with a side of dyspepsia, free of charge. Indigestion was practically the national ailment of Edwardian high society. Imagine sitting bolt upright in a stiff-backed chair, corset or collar digging into your ribs, while consuming mountains of roast beef, game birds, puddings and gallons of claret. The body was not designed for such punishment. Guests often left the table with stomachs rebelling, smiles plastered on their faces while praying no one noticed the audible gurgling beneath the music. Servants sometimes had to fetch smelling salts or discreetly guide a woozy guest toward a quieter room. The pace of dining didn't help. Courses arrived in rapid succession, leaving little time for digestion. Just as your stomach begged for mercy, another silver platter descended like a culinary ambush. Guests couldn't simply decline either. Refusing food risked insulting the host, so most ate dutifully, even when already stuffed to the gills. The result was a collective epidemic of discomfort masked by polite conversation and the occasional discreet loosening of waistcoats. Then there was the notorious Edwardian gout problem. Gout, often called the rich man's disease, thrived in dining rooms where port, game and rich sauces flowed freely. Swollen joints and painful attacks were almost badges of status, proof that you'd indulged in all the right excesses. Satirists loved to poke fun at gout-stricken aristocrats hobbling around on sticks, victims of their own gluttony. Yet the condition was no joke, it was debilitating, often leaving sufferers bedridden. Still, in Edwardian circles, better to be laid low by gout than to be suspected of not having dined richly enough to get it. Overeating was practically baked into the culture. The length of dinners, the insistence on sampling every course, and the competitive pressure to appear appreciative all conspired to push guests beyond reasonable limits. And this wasn't overeating by modern buffet standards, it was course after course of dense, fatty, sauce-laden food. A single Edwardian dinner might contain enough calories to sustain a working-class family for a week. The social elite waddled home with stomachs distended, clutching their bellies and swearing they'd eat lightly tomorrow until the next invitation arrived. The effects lingered well beyond the evening. Diaries and letters from the time often mention biliousness, the morning after, a polite euphemism for nausea, bloating, and general misery. Some relied on patent medicines, bitters, tonics, and dubious concoctions promising to aid digestion. Others leaned on bicarbonate of soda, essentially the Edwardian version of an antacid. Advertisements from the era were filled with products targeting indigestion and stomach complaints, because nearly everyone who attended dinner parties needed them. Even doctors fretted about the toll. Medical journals of the time warned of overfeeding among the upper classes, citing it as a contributor to heart disease and early death. But few listened. To dine lightly at a dinner party was practically unpatriotic, a betrayal of both host and empire. Better to eat oneself into dyspepsia than risk social obscurity. Moderation was for the middle classes, and let's not forget the corsets and collars. For women, tightly laced corsets made overeating nearly impossible without fainting. Many learned to nibble politely, not from lack of appetite, but from lack of physical room. Men, meanwhile, were trapped in starched collars and waistcoats that squeezed every bite upward into the realm of heartburn. The fashion of the era practically conspired with the food to guarantee discomfort. Humour aside, the health risks were real. Rich Edwardian diets contributed to widespread digestive issues, high cholesterol, though they didn't call it that yet, and the kinds of chronic ailments that modern medicine would later link to diet. Still, hosts and guests alike accepted these risks as the price of elegance. To eat sparingly might save your liver, but it would cost your reputation. What makes this all the more striking is the contrast with the wider population. While elites suffered from gout and indigestion brought on by excess, much of the working class struggled with diets that were plain, limited, and often insufficient. The Edwardian dinner party was a world apart, where too much was never enough, and too much was also making people ill. And yet the culture of excess endured. Guests joked about their ailments, treating them as badges of honour. The pheasant was divine, one might say, while clutching his stomach and limping from gout. Health concerns were acknowledged with a shrug and another glass of brandy, because in Edwardian Britain, what was the point of social climbing if you couldn't also eat yourself into an early grave? So imagine it, chandeliers blazing, laughter echoing, plates whisked away by servants, and beneath it all, 30 stomachs plotting revenge. The food might have been elegant, but the consequences were anything but. Every glittering dinner party ended the same way, with indigestion, regret, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow someone would be reaching for the bicarbonate. Because in Edwardian Britain, eating richly wasn't just a privilege, it was a health hazard, disguised as elegance. Behind every glittering Edwardian dinner party, every shimmering chandelier, every parade of courses and crystal glasses, lay one undeniable truth. Someone was footing the bill, and that bill was staggering. For all the glamour of Edwardian society, many families were broke, not from gambling, but from serving too many ducks in orange sauce. Hosting was not optional. If you wanted to climb the social ladder, maintain your position, or even just avoid slipping into obscurity, you had to throw dinners. Invitations were a currency, and failing to reciprocate meant risking exclusion. But reciprocity came at a ruinous price. Guests expected not just a meal, but a spectacle. Flowers, music, servants, elaborate menus, fine wines, and perhaps even entertainment after the plates were cleared. The cost of a single evening could rival a servant's yearly wage. The greatest expense was, of course, the food and drink. Imported fruits, exotic spices, fine wines, and lavish cuts of meat all had to be purchased in bulk. Hosts competed with each other, eager to impress guests with pineapple displays, imported hothouse grapes or salmon flown, or rather shipped in from Scotland. A modest spread was simply not acceptable. If your table lacked extravagance, you risked whispers about stinginess, a sin in Edwardian society that was almost as bad as actual crime. Then came the staffing costs. A proper dinner required an army of servants, cooks, scullery maids, butlers, footmen, parlour maids, and more. Each had to be dressed properly, trained to move silently, and coordinated to perfection. For smaller households, this meant hiring extra staff for the evening, a costly investment. The irony was brutal. Many hosts spent more on paying temporary servants for one dinner than on their own children's yearly clothing. Decorations added another layer of expense. The Edwardians adored flowers, preferably out-of-season ones that required costly cultivation in heated greenhouses. Table centerpieces were not just bouquets, they were floral landscapes spilling across linen like miniature gardens. Add to that the finest china, crystal glasses and silverware, sometimes borrowed or rented to meet the numbers, and the table alone became a financial minefield. Heaven forbid a guest noticed a mismatched spoon. It might undo weeks of careful social positioning. And then there was wine. Bottles of champagne, claret, sherry and port didn't come cheap, especially if the host wanted to impress with proper vintages. Wine cellars became arenas of competition, where families bankrupted themselves to stock rare bottles they didn't even enjoy drinking. Guests expected variety, no fewer than 5 or 6 types in one evening. A host who offered only 2 might as well have served vinegar. The hidden costs added up as well. Invitations had to be sent on fine stationery, written in elegant script. Candles and gaslight had to burn for hours, consuming fuel at a startling rate. Musicians, if hired, charged their own steep fees. Even carriage hire for guests had to be considered. Sometimes the host quietly subsidized transportation to ensure no one declined for lack of conveyance. A dinner was not just an event, it was an economic operation. The financial strain broke many households. Diaries from the time describe families cutting corners elsewhere, postponing repairs on their estates, skimping on clothing budgets or dismissing staff just to fund a dinner that would keep them in the social whirl. It was the Edwardian equivalent of maxing out a credit card for one spectacular Instagram moment. Except instead of likes, you got another round of invitations. What made it worse was the arms race of hosting. If Lady Ashcroft served 6 courses, Lady Pembroke had to serve 8. If the Carringtons imported French champagne, the Ellingtons imported German Riesling and French champagne. Competition drove extravagance, and extravagance drove ruin. Guests smiled, dined, and clapped politely while beneath the glittering tablecloths, hosts mentally calculated which heirlooms they might have to pawn. The pressure was particularly acute for the aspiring middle classes. Wealthy industrialists or professionals trying to break into aristocratic circles had to spend even more extravagantly to prove their worth. They knew established elites were watching for flaws, eager to dismiss them as vulgar upstarts. To avoid this, they overcompensated, importing pineapples by the dozen, hiring quartets instead of pianists, and drowning their guests in champagne until both their wallets and their livers cried for mercy. Even established aristocrats weren't immune. Old estates often had vast houses but dwindling finances. Maintaining appearances was essential, even if it meant serving banquets on borrowed silver while creditors circled. The paradox of Edwardian society was that those most admired for their hosting skills were often the ones suffering most behind the scenes. And still, they persisted. Why? Because not hosting was unthinkable. Without dinners, you lost visibility. Without visibility, you lost influence. And without influence, you slipped into irrelevance, left to dine quietly on plain roast beef while the rest of society sparkled on without you. Hosting was financial self-destruction disguised as social duty. So picture the Edwardian host, smiling graciously at 30 guests, raising a glass of champagne, while silently calculating whether the family jewels could be discreetly pawned to cover the bill for the pheasants. Guests laughed, musicians played, and the chandeliers glowed, all fueled by quiet financial panic. Because in Edwardian Britain, dinner parties weren't just meals, they were investments in survival, purchased one duck in orange sauce at a time. The Edwardian aristocracy may have invented the marathon dinner party, but it didn't take long for the middle classes to try their hand at imitation. After all, nothing says upward mobility like stuffing your friends full of roast beef under a too bright chandelier. Middle-class families desperately wanted the glamour of high society, but they didn't always have the money or the staff to pull it off. They had all the forks, but none of the staff to wash them. For the burgeoning middle class, doctors, lawyers, factory owners, and ambitious shopkeepers, the dinner party was a ticket to respectability. To be taken seriously, one had to host, and not just a simple supper, but something that looked as close to an aristocratic banquet as possible. The problem was that aristocrats had armies of servants, sprawling kitchens, and fortunes built on centuries of land ownership. The middle classes had a maid-of-all-work who doubled as cook, cleaner, and occasional babysitter. Still, the desire to mimic grandeur was unstoppable. Middle-class households invested in tableware with zeal. Forks, knives, spoons, and glasses for every conceivable purpose filled sideboards and china cabinets. Even if most of the family had no idea what half of them were for, they looked impressive. The middle-class dinner table gleamed with cutlery, but the real question was who was going to polish it all. Without a team of footmen, it often fell to the lady of the house or her one exhausted maid to shine enough silver to blind the guests. Menus posed another challenge. Middle-class hosts wanted to emulate aristocratic abundance, but 10 courses were financially ruinous. The solution? Scaled-down versions. Instead of salmon and pheasant, it might be trout and chicken. Instead of imported wines for every course, one carefully chosen claret did the heavy lifting. Soup, a roast, a pudding, and perhaps a fruit dish might suffice, dressed up with elaborate descriptions on handwritten menus. Call it potage à la maison instead of vegetable soup, and suddenly you sounded very refined. The performance extended to fashion and etiquette. Middle-class families studied etiquette manuals as if cramming for an exam, desperate to avoid missteps. Entire industries sprang up to serve their aspirations. Books like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management offered step-by-step guidance on hosting, how to set the table, how to serve, and most importantly, how to avoid humiliation when someone asked for the fish knife. These manuals promised that with enough effort, even modest homes could resemble Mayfair salons, at least until the pudding curdled. Of course, without battalions of servants, the illusion frequently cracked. A hostess might seat her guests elegantly, then dash into the kitchen to rescue the roast herself. A host might attempt to serve wine, fumbling awkwardly with corks while trying to imitate the smooth efficiency of a butler. Guests politely pretended not to notice when dishes arrived late, cold, or slightly burnt. Behind the curtain of respectability was chaos, pots clanging, maids weeping, and hosts praying no one asked for a second helping of the soufflé that had already collapsed. Middle-class dinners also revealed a different kind of anxiety, the fear of overreaching. Serve too modest a meal, and you risked being dismissed as provincial, but serve too grand a one, and you risked whispers of pretension. The balancing act was exhausting. Many middle-class families ended up bankrupting themselves on unnecessary luxuries, just as the aristocracy did, but without the safety net of inherited estates to cushion the fall. Yet these copycat dinners had their own charm. Guests knew the difference between Grosvenor Square and the suburbs, but they also appreciated the effort. A roast chicken lovingly basted by the hostess might not match a duchess's pheasant, but it was no less filling. And while the silver might be borrowed and the wine watered down, the laughter was often more genuine. Without the crushing weight of aristocratic formality, middle-class dinners could be warmer, looser, and dare one say, more fun. This desire to imitate wasn't purely social vanity. It was also aspirational. The Edwardian middle class was on the rise, buoyed by industry, commerce, and professional success. By mimicking the aristocracy's rituals, they signalled both belonging and ambition. Every extra fork, every carefully folded napkin, every French phrase on a menu card was a small step upward. Dinner parties were ladders disguised as meals. Of course, the aristocracy looked on with a mix of amusement and disdain. They try, some might remark, while sipping genuine French champagne. The upper classes knew the difference between true grandeur and imitation. Yet they also recognized that the middle classes were growing in influence. Their mimicry wasn't just parody, it was encroachment. The lines of social class were blurring, and dinner tables were one of the battlegrounds. So imagine it, a middle-class household in a modest villa, the dining room decked out with borrowed silverware and freshly ironed napkins. Guests arrive, chatter politely, and sit down to a meal that tries valiantly to be grand. The soup is slightly salty, the chicken slightly dry, but the atmosphere is eager and bright. Everyone knows it isn't Grosvenor Square, but for a few hours it feels close enough. Because in Edwardian Britain you didn't need an ancestral estate to host a dinner party. You just needed determination, a good etiquette book, and the stamina to wash 12 forks with only one maid to help. If Edwardian dinner parties were designed to impress, the press and satirists of the age were equally determined to deflate them. While hosts polished silver and orchestrated menus, newspapers and cartoonists sharpened their pens. For journalists and caricaturists, Edwardian dining was the gift that kept on giving, an endless parade of excess, vanity and missteps ripe for ridicule. Satirists basically turned the dinner table into an all-you-can-mock buffet. The Edwardian press thrived on society reporting. Newspapers regularly published accounts of grand dinners, listing who attended, what was served, and even what gowns were worn. But this reverent coverage coexisted with mockery. Behind the glossy columns praising the Duchess of So-and-so's pudding lay satirical magazines like Punch, which skewered the absurdities of upper-class dining. Where society editors saw refinement, cartoonists saw a room full of overstuffed peacocks. Cartoons were merciless. Illustrators exaggerated swollen bellies, tight collars, and ludicrous amounts of cutlery. A common trope depicted aristocrats slumped at the table, groaning under the weight of too many courses. Another favourite showed women fainting dramatically in corsets while men puffed cigars like locomotives. Servants were sometimes drawn as silent martyrs, balancing towers of dishes, while their employers debated the finer points of pheasant versus partridge. The underlying message was clear. These banquets weren't just elegant, they were absurd. The satire also targeted the sheer formality of dinner. Caricatures highlighted the ridiculousness of rules, guests drowning in forks, men consulting etiquette manuals mid-meal, or terrified diners sweating over which knife to pick up next. In an age increasingly aware of social inequalities, such cartoons resonated with readers outside the gilded dining rooms. To the average Edwardian clerk eating boiled potatoes at home, the idea of aristocrats fainting into soufflé was hilarious and reassuring. At least indigestion was one privilege of the rich they didn't have to share. Newspapers also loved scandalous mishaps. Reports of fainting ladies, spilled wine or collapsed desserts were sensationalized for maximum effect. While society columns might politely gloss over these moments, satirical outlets gleefully exaggerated them. A small slip of etiquette could be transformed into a symbolic failure of the entire aristocracy. If Lord So-and-so forgot to stand when the Queen's name was mentioned, cartoonists drew him grovelling under the table while guests gasped in horror. Importantly, satire wasn't just entertainment, it was social commentary. The Edwardian period was one of stark contrasts. Immense wealth for some, grinding poverty for many. Mocking the gluttony of dinner parties was a way of highlighting inequality. When cartoonists sketched lords drowning in gravy, they were also hinting at the coal miners who could barely afford bread. Laughter at excess doubled as criticism of a system out of touch with reality. Some satirical pieces poked fun at the pretensions of the middle class. Families trying to mimic aristocratic dinners were mocked for their over-the-top efforts. Cartoons showed shopkeepers staggering under the weight of borrowed silverware, or middle-class matrons instructing exhausted maids to serve soup à la française, while the pot clearly came from a local grocer. The humour wasn't just about the elite, it was about anyone caught in the trap of trying too hard. Literary satire also joined the feast. Novelists like E.M. Forster and Arnold Bennett included scenes that gently mocked the absurdities of social dining. Plays of the time often featured dinners gone wrong, with comic misunderstandings over etiquette or servants causing mayhem. Theatre audiences roared at exaggerated portrayals of gluttonous aristocrats, recognising both the truth and the parody in what they saw. Even the language of menus became a target. Satirists mocked the fashion of writing dishes in French, even when the food was plainly English. Why call it potage à la maison when it was clearly just vegetable soup? Cartoons lampooned hosts who couldn't pronounce their own menus, stumbling over words while servants smirked behind them. The joke was obvious. Aristocrats might be rich, but they weren't always cultured. Yet for all the mockery, the satire never fully toppled the dinner party. If anything, it fueled its fame. Being satirized was almost a badge of honor. It meant your dinners were important enough to be noticed. Guests laughed at the jokes in Punch, but still eagerly attended the next overstuffed banquet. The paradox was delicious. Ridicule and reverence coexisted, and both kept the obsession alive. For the wider public, satire was a window into a world they would never enter. Cartoons of top-hatted men clutching their stomachs or women fainting into aspic allowed ordinary readers to feel both superior and excluded at once. They could laugh at the absurdity while also envying the spectacle. Dinner parties may have been ridiculous, but they were still glamorous. So imagine the Edwardian drawing room not just filled with music and chatter, but echoing in the next day's newspapers as a punchline. Hosts preened under candlelight while cartoonists sharpened their pencils, ready to turn pheasant into parody. No soufflé was safe, no corset immune, because in Edwardian Britain, dinner parties weren't just feasts for the elite, they were also feasts for the satirists, who devoured every faux pas and burp of excess with relish. For all the glittering chandeliers, mountains of silverware, and soups that tested your ability not to slurp like a walrus, Edwardian dinner parties had one fatal flaw: They belong to a world that vanished almost overnight. The First World War didn't just redraw maps and topple empires, it also killed the craze for endless courses and lobster forks. After the war, fewer people cared about lobster forks and more about not starving. The Edwardian dinner party was a product of its time, a moment of extravagance, security and rigid hierarchy. But when war broke out in 1914, the foundations of that world cracked. Suddenly, lavish feasts felt grotesque in the face of food shortages, rationing, and the grim reality of battlefields. The dinner table could no longer be a playground for excess when so many were struggling simply to eat. During the war, rationing reshaped eating habits. Meat, sugar, and fats became scarce, and the government urged households to economize. Gone were the days of 10-course menus boasting exotic imports. Families boiled turnips instead of flambeing pheasants. A hostess who once prided herself on her pineapple centerpiece now had to improvise with cabbage. Even the wealthy found it unseemly to flaunt abundance when soldiers were fighting and civilians were queuing for bread. Social survival now required restraint, not extravagance. The war also shattered the servant system. Many male servants enlisted, while women sought better-paying work in munitions factories. By 1918, households that once had armies of staff struggled to find even a single reliable cook. Without butlers to manage the wine or footmen to parade the soup, the mechanics of a grand Edwardian dinner became impossible. What good were 20 forks if no one was available to polish them? Culturally, the mood shifted. Before the war, showing off through feasts was expected. Afterward, it seemed tone-deaf. A society that had endured mass death and trauma was less inclined to admire someone's ability to juggle asparagus tongs. Guests wanted sincerity, simplicity, and comfort, not performances staged with soufflés. Elaborate table etiquette looked outdated, like an antique relic from a world too naive to survive. The aristocracy itself was in decline. War debts, higher taxes, and the decline of land-based wealth stripped many families of their ability to host extravagantly. Large houses were sold off or converted to schools and hospitals. Maintaining grand dining rooms became an impossible luxury. For those who survived the war, a quiet supper with family replaced the parade of pheasants and champagne. The obsession with spectacle gave way to the practicality of survival. The new middle class and rising industrial elite also redefined what it meant to host. Practicality replaced pomp. Instead of sprawling banquets with 10 courses, dinners became simpler affairs with 3 or 4. Conversation mattered more than the placement of forks. Efficiency became fashionable. In a sense, the modern dinner party, still elegant but stripped of absurdity, was born out of post-war necessity. Even the press shifted tone. Before the war, society pages fawned over menus and gowns. Afterward, such excess seemed frivolous at best, offensive at worst. The new heroes were not hostesses who staged glittering banquets, but women who volunteered, worked and adapted during hardship. Public admiration shifted from the lady with the grandest table to the one who could make rations stretch the furthest. Psychologically, the war also made people impatient with rigid etiquette. Having seen the collapse of empires and the fragility of life, many no longer cared whether someone picked up the wrong fork. A generation that had trudged through mud and trenches couldn't be bothered with rules about soup spoons. Social rituals relaxed, reflecting a broader democratization of society. Formality gave way to informality, and the dinner party transformed into something less intimidating and more accessible. Of course, some still clung to the old ways. A handful of die-hard hostesses tried to revive the glittering Edwardian feast in the 1920s, but these attempts looked increasingly anachronistic. Guests humoured them, but the appetite for extravagance was gone. Jazz-age cocktails, finger food and shorter menus were the future. The Edwardian model, heavy roasts, endless courses and orchestras hidden behind ferns, became as outdated as horse-drawn carriages. In the end, the decline of the Edwardian dinner party was less about food and more about context. The world that had sustained it, hierarchical, confident, oblivious, was gone. What remained was a society scarred, cautious, and unwilling to waste time on performances that no longer made sense. A dinner could still be elegant, but it no longer needed to be a theatrical production requiring 30 servants and a financial strategy. So picture the post-war home. Simpler menus, fewer guests, and no one fainting into the pudding because pudding itself had become a luxury. The chandelier still glowed, but the atmosphere had changed. No one was impressed by a pineapple centerpiece anymore. They were impressed if you had bread and butter, because in the wake of World War I, Edwardian dinner parties went the way of gaslight and hoop skirts, relics of a gilded age that ended not with dessert but with the sound of gunfire. The chandeliers have dimmed, the corsets unlaced, and the last soufflé has long since collapsed into history. But the Edwardian dinner party never really disappeared, it simply changed form. Though we no longer summon armies of footmen to serve oysters under candlelight, traces of Edwardian obsession still haunt our modern tables. Edwardians perfected the art of dining. We perfected the art of eating pizza in bed. First, there's fine dining itself. The Edwardian passion for multiple courses, matched wines, and theatrical presentation didn't die. It migrated to restaurants. The Michelin-starred tasting menu is, in many ways, a descendant of Edwardian feasting. Instead of salmon drowned in bechamel, you get 12 tasting portions with names like beetroot air and foraged foam. The logic is the same: too much food disguised as sophistication, designed less to nourish than to impress. Hell, every time you stare at a plate decorated with a single pea and a swirl of sauce, you are, without realizing it, at an Edwardian table reborn. Cutlery etiquette also lingers. While most of us no longer have to navigate 10 forks, the basic rules start from the outside and work your way in. Don't wave your knife around like a fencing foil. Come straight from Edwardian and earlier Victorian manuals. That anxiety you feel when handed a fork you've never seen before, that's Edwardian ghost energy, whispering, choose wrong and perish socially. Even today, fine dining can feel like a test, and that's no accident. It's a faint echo of Edwardian nights when fork selection was practically a blood sport. Then there's the social networking aspect. Edwardian dinners weren't just about food, they were about forging alliances, making matches, and securing influence. Swap pheasants for canapés, and you get the modern business dinner, wedding banquet, or fundraising gala. The room may be smaller, the menu simpler, but the goal is identical. Gather people in one place, feed them, and watch relationships sprout over shared plates. Dinner, whether in 1910 or 2025, remains the stage for human ambition. Even the notion of dining as performance survives. The Edwardians knew a meal wasn't just eaten, it was seen, narrated, and judged. Sound familiar? Instagram has become the modern drawing room. Instead of gossiping about Lady Pembroke's pheasant, we double-tap a photo of avocado toast. Instead of being mocked in Punch magazine, we risk becoming a meme. The same impulse drives both worlds. Show off your plate and prove you belong. Of course, much has changed. We don't usually faint into puddings. Servants don't hover silently with soup ladles, and most of us can't afford to bankrupt ourselves on pineapples. Post-WWI realities made extravagance unfashionable, and modern sensibilities prize convenience and comfort. A lavish Edwardian feast was about restraint, disguised as indulgence. You were supposed to eat elegantly, not hungrily. Today, the average dinner guest piles food like a construction site and asks for seconds without fear of social death. Still, the aura of Edwardian dining persists wherever food and status intersect. Think of celebrity galas where menus are written in French, or luxury restaurants that expect you to know the difference between 3 types of spoons. Think of how people still joke about fork anxiety at weddings, or struggle with the correct glass at a wine tasting. Those aren't new anxieties, they're hand-me-downs from a time when etiquette ruled the table. Interestingly, some of the more absurd Edwardian habits have flipped into modern rebellion. They starved elegantly under chandeliers. We devour fast food on couches. They whispered gossip over pudding. We tweet it in real time. They performed dinner as theatre. We embrace casual dining as liberation. Where they needed orchestras, we need streaming services. The dinner party didn't vanish. It just put on sweatpants. And yet, when we do stage modern formal dinners, weddings, banquets, state events, we unconsciously recreate Edwardian grandeur. The line of servers, the precise seating charts, the endless speeches between courses, all echoes of a society that worshipped the table as much as the church or the crown. Every time a head of state clinks champagne flutes under a chandelier, an Edwardian hostess somewhere nods in approval. Ultimately, the legacy of Edwardian dinner parties isn't just in forks or menus. It's in the idea that food is never just food. It's status, it's performance, it's community, it's theatre. We may eat differently now, but we still understand what they understood. that breaking bread together is never neutral. Whether it's lobster in 1910 or takeout sushi today, meals are about connection and display as much as digestion. So next time you sit at a formal dinner, nervously juggling 3 glasses and 5 forks, remember, you're channeling an Edwardian ghost. And next time you sit in bed with pizza balanced on your lap, remember, you're rebelling against the same ghost. Either way, the Edwardians are still at the table, because in the end, their obsession didn't disappear, it evolved. And while we may laugh at their soufflé collapses and fork anxieties, we owe them one thing: they turned dinner into theatre. We just gave the show cheaper tickets.